Well, welcome everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started with a few brief introductions before our panel of speakers begins. So I'm Karen Bierman. I direct the Child Studies Center here at Penn State. We're absolutely delighted to be hosting this event on leveraging systems to improve and expand child sexual abuse prevention. We're hosting it this year in partnership with the Child Maltreatment Solutions Network and the Center for Healthy Children, also at Penn State. The Innovation Hub was designed originally to shine a light on really critical issues that affect the well-being of children, youth, and families in areas where there is new research that really has some important insights and opportunities to offer to prevention and intervention efforts. This year, we're focusing on the child sexual abuse prevention because it's such a critically important area for our country, and one where there has been some really important innovative research in recent years that we'll be highlighting in the hub. Our goal is to really highlight some of the new insights that have come from this research, but also to spark more partnership and communication with practitioners to figure out how do we take advantage of this research in the field? How do we start moving to really expand the opportunity for strong evidence-based prevention in this important area across the country? So that's our modest goal. I'd like to make one housekeeping comment. Because we are a very large group today, we have turned off the capacity for you to comment during the presentations, but we will be taking questions after each speaker. Please just put your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring that continually during the event and try to get to as many of those questions as we can. I'd like to turn things over now to Dr. Jenny Knoll, who's going to be the head moderator for this event. Jenny is the director of both the Child Maltreatment Solutions Network and also the Center for Healthy Children, which is the first really large national center that's devoted to child maltreatment understanding and prevention. She's extremely well known for her research in the area of child sexual abuse, both trying to understand more about the causes and the impact it has on children, as well as in the recent research that you'll hear about later today with Kate Gustafaro, who is the co-host with her, their prevention research, which has some really exciting outcomes. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jenny to give you an overview of our topic and begin to introduce our speakers.
Thanks so much, Karen, for that nice introduction and for your leadership and also for devoting the resources of your hub to this important topic. It's an impressive endeavor, the hub, and we hope to take full advantage of the spirit of the Innovation Hub. So welcome, everyone. My job here today is to set the stage and provide an overview of what we're doing today and to get everybody on the same page with our definitions and sort of the focus that we want the hub to take today. So let's just jump right in and get started. So the whys and the hows of preventing childhood sexual abuse is what we're talking about here. So let's all get on the same page with the definition of what childhood sexual abuse is. I know that probably all of you here don't need this introductory lecture about the scope and gravity of child sexual abuse, but it's really important to get definitions straight because one of the things we want to do is distinguish sexual abuse from sexual assault. And sexual abuse are sexual acts with a child under the age of 18, which is the definition that we're focusing on here, that involve direct physical contact or non-contact sexual acts, where there is no or limited capacity to provide true consent. And when we look at some real good research on the pooled international aggregate rates, they come in at about 15% of girls and 8% of boys worldwide who will be victims of childhood sexual abuse by the time they turn 18. And just a note on the incidence rates in the US, they really have plateaued over the last 15 years. And that's remarkable when we think about all the innovations in prevention in this country, and that childhood sexual abuse is not one of those public health problems that has been affected by these innovations. And in fact, in the last incidence studies, we're actually seeing our first uptick in nearly 3 decades of childhood sexual abuse incidents. And to add to what we are concerned about when it comes to childhood sexual abuse is this new advent of the internet-initiated sexual exploitation and sex crimes over the internet, with this generation of kids really being the first generation to grow up with unfettered access to the internet and the proliferation of social media in social discourse for kids, and the new ways that perpetration is happening online in terms of luring kids into pornography, exchange of sexual imaging, and then ultimately luring kids offline, and then risk for sex trafficking and sexual victimization, which has been on the rise, right? And is a concern by the US State Department as reported in 2016. We also know that childhood sexual abuse is quite costly. And in a cost analysis done by Elizabeth Letourneau and her team, the associated costs are quite large and on par with other public health crises, to the tune of $9.3 billion for the lifetime burden of 1 year's worth of victims. And so when we're talking about the public health income, when we're talking about scope and gravity, the cost of a public health issue matters. So too, when we start talking about sexual abuse being a public health issue, it is advantageous to point out the sequelae of childhood sexual abuse and the research that has shown how survivors fare across development. And there's a myriad of studies and a lot of research that has been culminated in this annual review, if you want to see it in 2021, about the sexual and mental health outcomes associated uniquely with childhood sexual abuse that are different from other forms of abuse, including high-risk sexual behaviors, sexually transmitted infections, things like teen pregnancy and sexual victimization, but also interpartner violence, sexual dysfunction, mood and anxiety disorders, PTSD, attachment difficulties both to partners and to children, showcasing the intergenerational transmission of the effects of childhood sexual abuse, and alcohol and substance use disorders. And in the last few decades, we've really been understanding the impact of childhood sexual abuse on physical health and cognitive health outcomes. These are things like the impact on stress-mediated processes that can result in things like early pubertal development, the development of obesity over time, immune function deficits, inflammatory markers, cognitive deficits, premature delivery of children, and we are starting to see even evidence for accelerated cognitive age. So what are the things that we know about how perpetration happens, and what are some of the basic tenets for what we already know in the literature? We know that 90% of victims know their perpetrator. When it comes to prevention, these are all things that help us understand how prevention is going to work, with 30% of victims abused by a family member, 60% are abused by someone who is trusted by the family, or who gain access to kids through the avenue of trust from parents and other people in the family. We know that less than 45% of victims disclose within 5 years, and 12 to 17% never disclose to anyone until adulthood. And sadly, less than 20% get referred to evidence-based treatments. So what makes sexual abuse so hard to prevent? I mean, these are things that we have tried to understand, and we were culminating when we were talking about strategies for prevention. And sexual abuse is difficult to talk about. It's one of those things that we need to talk about the framing of when we start to talk to policymakers and to other stakeholders about how to prevent sexual abuse, because many people either don't want to talk about it or don't believe that it can actually happen in their own family, in their own community, in their own school settings. Not to mention that unlike other forms of abuse like physical abuse and neglect, the physical signs are often rare. You don't always see the physical signs of sexual abuse. Partly because sexual abuse occurs in a shroud of secrecy. There's a lot of secrecy around the grooming of children for sexual abuse. In fact, children are often threatened to keep this a secret in the MO of perpetrators. Sexual abuse is also difficult to prosecute. Evidence can be difficult to obtain, and laws and policies put limits on disclosure timeframes via statutes of limitations. Sexual abuse can also result in significant family disruption, and we don't yet understand the full scope of internet sex crimes. So when we think about prevention of something as prolific and as something as has the large scope and gravity that sexual abuse has, we think about what we call primary prevention, and that is stopping abuse before it happens. That's what we mean by primary prevention. And there are several ways that we think about primary prevention. And one of those is a universal strategy. A universal strategy, that means that everyone in the population would receive some light touch or some overall inoculation and education about what sexual abuse is and how to think about preventing it, how to make reports, and just overall raise awareness and education about the problem. So when we think about universal strategies, we hope that these are the kinds of strategies that will ultimately result in incidence rates being impacted, incidence rates going down ultimately. And we want these things, right, to be feasible, to be sustainable, to be cost effective, to be acceptable by the population, and to have a large reach such that there is buy-in from stakeholders, including policymakers. So all of these things we need to think about when we are aspiring to a universal prevention effort. The other way to think about primary prevention is targeted or selective strategies. And there was a really good paper by Ken Dodge a few years ago that I encourage anyone who's thinking about targeted prevention to look at, because what Dr. Dodge did was he talked about the cost benefits of really targeting the segment of the population that is in the most need for the preventative intervention. So thinking about those who need it most and delivering more intensive programming to those who might need it most. So when we think about targeted or selective interventions and the cost effectiveness of these strategies, that helps us understand maybe sustainability and sort of the cost benefit. We want to also think about what systems are out there to help us leverage and to maximize the reach to those who will benefit most. So in both the universal and targeted strategies, we want to think about what systems are out there that would help us maximize the reach of our prevention strategies. Let me give you an example of what a targeted strategy might look like. When we think about targeted strategies, you want to think about the places where the abuse happens most, or where can we target? And one of the things that we're thinking about right now is targeting households at highest risk. And what we mean are not households where we think people are necessarily going to sexually abuse their kids, but households where there are parents who may inadvertently create environments where exploitive individuals gain access to their kids. And what we know from the literature is that high-risk households have parents who have mental health and/or substance abuse problems, where there's low social support for caregiving, where child surveillance and supervision is challenging, and where there's prior or current involvement in the child welfare system. So we might think about leveraging systems where parent training is already delivered, where there are widely disseminated parent programs like those pictured here, but where sexual abuse prevention can augment those programs. So that's an example of how targeted intervention might work. just like everything, evidence-based matters. We need to bring promising programs into the evidence base because, like it or not, evidence-based matters. It matters to stakeholders. It matters to policymakers. Policymakers are increasingly engaged in evidence-based decision-making. And there's specific language in many of our federal child abuse prevention policies, such as CAPTA, Family First, and McVie. Evidence-based also matters to funders. A lot of funders won't give money to programs that haven't reached the evidence base. So it's becoming imperative to bring promising programs into the evidence base, for example, through peer-reviewed randomized clinical trials. Ideally, we would strive to show that these programs result in long-term follow-up gains. So following people who have gone through these programs over time to ensure that they've retained the information, and showing change not just in knowledge and education, but in the change of behaviors. So monitoring or actually assessing whether behavior change has resulted from the intervention. And then ultimately demonstrating that sexual abuse rates change because of our interventions. So what are the prevailing strategies out there? Well, there are many buckets to think about that people have taken on in terms of how to affect change in terms of sexual abuse rates. And these come in many different forms, and you can kind of see them all here. So depending on what community you live in or who your stakeholders are, you might choose from one of these buckets as an acceptable strategy for spending your prevention dollars. So for example, a community-based strategy is one that educates the broad community. It may be in terms of media campaigns or overall campaigns to bring awareness, broad awareness to the problem. There's also evidence-based programs like Darkness to Light Stewards of Children that actually invite people on a voluntarily basis to go through some programming in a single 3-hour session to educate them about sexual abuse, how to report sexual abuse, and what to look for in terms of the signs of sexual abuse. Then there are programs that really target organizations. So targeting organizations to help them understand if their organization might be vulnerable to having exploitive individuals have access to kids and how to create safe environments for their kids within these organizations. These are things like Circles of Safety, which is an intervention for organizations, primarily youth serving organizations and caregiving organizations, and things like the iLookout program that teaches early childhood educators on mandated reporting and how to report abuse. Another thing to think about are some emerging programs that target potential perpetrators. So these are things that programs like the Dunkelfeld program in Germany, which aids those who have an attraction to children in getting help before they act on those urges. Stop It Now also has some resources for potential perpetration that are being brought to the evidence space. But there's a program that Dr. Letourneau will talk about today called the Responsible Behavior with Younger Children for middle school kids. And she'll talk a little bit more about that. The other bucket is really the hardening the target or inoculation against those who might be targeted for child sexual abuse. And that includes intervening with children and adolescents. So programs like the Evidence-Based Safe Touches program, which is delivered in a single session in schools, that teaches children what sexual abuse is, that it's wrong, how to get help, and the difference between secrets and surprises and so forth. There are other programs targeted to adolescents. Safe Dates and Shifting Boundaries are too, but it should be noted that these programs are really geared toward peer victimization. But I would put Dr. Letourneau's program for responsible behaviors in this bucket too, because that is geared toward adolescents and does have a target toward inoculating adolescents against sexual abuse. And then of course, there's the parent bucket. So parents, targeting parents because parents are the chief agents of change for the family. They are the chief operators of who gets access to children. So targeting parents specifically is also another bucket. And for example, the parent-focused Smarter Parents, Safer Kids program that we'll talk about later is an example of an evidence program in that bucket. And then there are coordinated efforts. There are not very many of these coordinated efforts, but those who are thinking about the largest scope are thinking about how to take multiple strategies at once and implement them to different stakeholders in the community. So this is an example of an effort that we did with the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency in 5 counties in Pennsylvania, where we implemented stewards of children to 5% of the adult population, safe touches to 100% of second graders in these communities, and then to high-risk parents in the child welfare system, the Smarter Parents, Safer Kids. And what have we learned from these coordinated efforts? Although these are still ongoing, the major thing that we've learned is that reach matters, that reach, the amount of people that are actually get the program, is a major driver of the universal impact, of the success of the strategy, of the probability that rates will actually be impacted. But it's also a major driver of our cost analyses. We're doing cost analyses of what it takes to implement these programs. And the major driver of the cost is the number of people that are reached. So the more people that are reached, the more cost effective the implementation strategy. And then all engaged people and maximizing engagement with this reach is also a major factor in the success. So what are the next steps and what are we going to concentrate on today then? Bringing promising programs into the evidence space is a vital next step. Demonstrating the long-term impacts on rates is a vital next step to implore larger public investment on the part of policymakers to spend now to save public costs later, to increase engagement and to extend reach by leveraging systems for both universal and targeted prevention. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share now and turn it over to Dr. Elizabeth Letourneau. And Dr. Letourneau is a professor in the Department of Mental Health and the director of the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And Dr. Letourneau is gonna take it away and share her screen with everybody.
Thank you, Jenny, and give me just a second. Sky, I want to check that you can hear me.
I can hear you just fine.
Great, and then I want to check that you can see my slides. And give it a second. Oops.
We can see that.
All right, thank you. Well, thanks, Jenny. I am delighted to be part of the Innovation Hub's annual symposium. And just want to spend a moment talking about the Moore Center and then tell you more about this innovative school-based perpetration prevention intervention that my colleagues and I have developed and conducted some preliminary evaluation with. But about the Moore Center, we launched the Moore Center 10 years ago, the Moore Center for the Prevention of Child Sexual Abuse 10 years ago, with some generous philanthropic support from Steve and Julia Moore. The center and our faculty, staff, and students seek to prevent harm from occurring in the first place through research, education, communication, advocacy, and policy efforts. And we have a particular focus on perpetration prevention, which we'll talk about a little bit more. One of the models that guides and helps frame our work is the public health model for violence prevention. This is a really simple 4-step model. Came out of the CDC and work by Jim Mercy and others at the CDC back in the late 80s. And this is the same model that the CDC really uses for injury prevention and infection prevention and so on, disease prevention. And so you start by defining the problem. What's the scope of the problem? Jenny mentioned the scope of child sexual abuse, 15% of girls, 8% of boys worldwide. It also helped to know the scope of perpetration, which there's almost no data on worldwide. We secured a large grant from the Human Dignity Foundation to begin to establish perpetration prevalence rates in the US and in other countries. And I'm excited to be launching that work this year. In addition to defining the problem or the scope of the problem, you need to identify risk and protective factors. And we'll talk for a moment about what are some risk and protective factors for perpetration. Jenny mentioned some of the risk factors that we look at for targeting individuals and communities with interventions, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. And then based on those risk and protective factors, you develop your prevention strategies, right? So you want to link your prevention strategies to either mitigate risk factors or to promote and elevate and enhance protective factors. And then, and this is the important part, rigorously evaluate those prevention strategies before they get launched worldwide. And that's something else that I think Jenny has a really important and very strong focus on, and all of the people that you'll hear speak today, I believe, also share that strong focus on the importance of making sure that the intervention works as intended and that it causes no harm. And there's plenty of interventions out there that cause harm. So this is actually an important step. And then of course you want to assure widespread adoption, adaptation of interventions as needed for new regions, new populations, and so on. So when it comes to perpetration of child sexual abuse, what we know about the scope is, and this may surprise a lot of you, is that somewhere between 50 and 70% of offenses against children are committed by children, by people under the age of 18. And usually they're committed by kids just a couple or 3 or 4 years older than the victim. So this is in the US, we're not entirely sure how well this finding generalizes, but certainly other countries have large portions of kids who are causing harmful sexual behavior. And when we look at the risk and protective factors, we know that age matters. So as kids develop into early pubescence, ages 11, 12, 13, that's where we see arrest rates increase for harmful sexual behavior. And those arrest rates peak at 14 and then decline precipitously at the age of 15, particularly against younger kids. And that's a classic learning curve. So what we know is that kids eventually figure out that younger children are off limits as sexual partners. Unfortunately, it takes them a little bit of time. They don't know, they're vulnerable to making mistakes and bad decisions as they become sexual. They lack knowledge. They don't understand the laws or even know about the laws and rules that govern sexuality. They're curious, they're impulsive, they have the surge of hormones that is helping to drive them to seek out intimate contact. But we're all vulnerable to making mistakes and bad decisions when we're first learning a complex behavior. And there is literally nothing more complex than kind of intimate behavior. And unlike driving, for example, where we teach kids, I have a 17-year-old who's just about to get his proper driver's license. And we take them through practice sessions, endless driving sessions. They go through classes. They have to demonstrate their abilities before we hand them a license. And when it comes to sexual behavior, instead of providing helpful and useful information, we actually kind of systematically protect kids from that information. And so what we see is that they make a lot of mistakes. And then there's some other risk factors as well. But with those other risk factors, the age, lack of knowledge, sexual curiosity, impulsivity, things that characterize kids in general suggest is that we need universal prevention interventions. So we can have targeted interventions that may target kids who might be a particular risk. For example, there are some people who are sexually attracted to younger children. We have a prevention intervention for them as well called Help Wanted that we developed and are evaluating at the Moore Center. But we need more universal programs because we know that the risk factors for engaging in harmful sexual behavior with younger children are universal risk factors. And then the fourth step, disseminating effective interventions. Jenny mentioned that one barrier to the uptake of effective interventions or even to the development and evaluation of them is that we don't tend to think of child sexual abuse as a preventable public health problem. We think of it as a criminal justice problem, and we put all of our resources almost into after the fact interventions, for example, incarceration. And we have a paper coming out sometime this quarter that shows that the U.S. spends about $5.4 billion every year solely to lock up people for sex crimes against children. So that's $5.4 billion that comes after a kid's already been harmed, and in the case of kids who offend, after a kid has caused harm, and it's too late. It's certainly important to hold adults accountable, but putting that many resources into after the fact interventions and almost no resources into prevention intervention is not going to get us to zero abuse, which is where we all want to be. So given that adolescents perpetrate a fair amount of harm against younger children, given that the risk factors are universal, as I mentioned, we developed responsible behavior with younger children. And I want to give a brief shout out to Amanda Ruzicka, Luciana Sini-Mayton, Catherine Bradshaw, who you'll hear from later today, who all were co-developers of this intervention and participated in the, helped lead, in fact, the initial pilot trial of this intervention. RBYC is a universal perpetration-focused prevention curriculum that targets 6th and 7th grade kids. And it targets kids in that age because that's right when kids are most vulnerable to making mistakes and bad decisions when it comes to beginning to engage in sexual behaviors. So it targets those kids and their parents and educators. And the idea is to improve their knowledge and give them tools and skills both to avoid engaging younger children in sexual behavior and as well as a little bit of tools and skills around peer sexual harassment, avoid online behaviors that are harmful or illegal, and know what to do if you suspect a child has been or is at risk of being abused. The curriculum for RBYC is about 8 sessions. These are the core topics of each session. We start a little bit gently with kids by talking about developmental differences between them and their younger siblings, their younger neighbors, their cousins, the other younger kids in the school. We encourage them and try to help them take more of a empathic perspective towards younger kids. Younger kids can be super annoying, we know that, but here's why we want you to be careful with them and to take care with children that are younger than you. And then we move into very clear, using very clear language, what are healthy and unhealthy kind of teen, younger children relationships, and what is child sexual abuse? Why does it happen? What are the laws that regulate sexual behavior of children? What are the contexts in which it's more likely to occur? We don't demonize kids who engage in these behaviors, nor should anyone. So you'll notice I don't talk about juvenile sex offenders or perpetrators or predators or any of that kind of horrible language that we actually know through research causes people to think of these kids as hopeless cases. These are kids, and they're kids first. They're even kids who have offended and been adjudicated almost never reoffend sexually. So we know that they are really good candidates for prevention, and they're also very good candidates for treatment. So we are careful about how we talk, and I'm always careful about how I talk in these kinds of presentations. We provide information on child sexual abuse facts, as I said, and laws and legal ramifications, how to act if you suspect abuse is happening, how to avoid it from happening yourself if you're in a situation where it might be at risk. And then, as I said, we spend some time on responsible behavior with peers. Jenny mentioned there are 2 well-validated peer-focused interventions. Shifting boundaries is a phenomenal intervention. Safe dates is one that many of you may well know. We did not feel the need to reinvent those wheels. However, when you are engaging in school systems, you need to address school system issues, and peer sexual harassment, online sexual offending are of interest to those schools. So we did include some content there as well. And then, as I mentioned, we talk about, we work with kids to help actually intervene if they suspect abuse is happening, which is what we mean by being a good upstander. I'm going to go through each of these sessions briefly. I don't have a lot of time, and get to the results of a pilot evaluation that we completed recently. So the session 1, talking about teaching kids about developmental differences, the idea here again is to really help kids appreciate the developmental differences between them and kids who are even just a few years younger than they are. I mean, if you're 11, 12, 13, you might not really be thinking about the developmental differences between you and a 9 or an 8-year-old, but there are. And I should also point out, we designed RBYC to involve a lot of activities. We did some focus groups with kids and also with caregivers and with educators. And in the focus groups, everyone emphasized the importance of using a lot of activities to keep the kids engaged, or to get them engaged and keep them engaged. And we do that. So we do some role plays is one of the things we do, where we have kids act out, you know, how might a 3-year-old respond if he's told or she's told she can't have this expensive thing they want, versus how would you respond? And little kids throw temper tantrums, and you're not doing that anymore. And that's one of the developmental differences. The kids really enjoy these kinds of activities. The second session is, again, perspective taking, empathic responding. You know, what do we do when a kid is being irritating and annoying? How can we respond in a way that's helpful? We may need to just take a little bit of a time out, you know, we being the kid, if the kid is about to perhaps yell or harm a younger kid, or go find an adult. But how can we kind of come at younger kids with more empathy? The third session is where we get into healthy and unhealthy relationships between older kids and younger kids. And the kids told us they wanted to be called teens, even the 11 and 12-year-olds, so we use their language. Here we define sexual consent, and I would say, you know, many adults don't have a good appreciation of what consent, what are the components of sexual consent. Our kids do. We did a good job of training that. That's one of the significant findings we found in our pilot study. We talked about the importance of consent. And I will say, you know, we acknowledge that in the United States and most other countries, there are laws that suggest that children cannot provide consent, and that's why we don't allow adults to have sex even with teenagers up through age 16 or 17. But certainly kids engage in sexual behavior with one another, and so we use that word consent in its general meaning, not in its legal meaning. Here's where we also talk about and define what is child sexual abuse, and we show the consent as T video. And if you have never watched the consent as T video, you should Google it. Watch it on YouTube. It is brilliant. And we're actually working with the designers of that video to develop some more video content for RBYC, because it was hands down everybody, including the educators, favorite part of their favorite session of this intervention. So if we had more time, I would show it to you. It's only a couple minutes long, but it's absolutely worth watching it on your next break. We have a second session that also focuses on healthy and unhealthy older kid, younger kid behaviors. And here's where we talk about, you know, how to respond to kids who might be engaging in behavior that looks sexual, for example. And we use a behavior card game. What do you do if a younger kid comes into a room naked? You know, what's your response? Is this response a good response? Is it a response that's more likely to avoid harm or lead to harm? And so that's another great in-class activity. We have a session on facts and laws, so the kids know the laws. Kids don't know age of consent laws. They're certainly not born with that knowledge. And again, many parents don't, and the other adults don't have a good handle on these laws. Most people don't know kids can be tried and adjudicated for sex crimes. They can be sent to prison, very often are. They can be put on sex offender registries and subjected to public notification, often for life. We hold kids accountable for their sexual behaviors as if they were 35-year-old sex offenders. They are not, and we should not, but we do. And we need children to be aware of what are the potential consequences of their behavior. And there is some research that suggests when kids have this understanding, they modify their behavior. So this is for this activity, we have the cross the line, which is you have all the kids stand up and they take a step forward if they think a specific fact is true, and they take a step backwards if it's not true. And then they can go home and test their parents, which is really great. Because there's a couple of questions that everybody gets wrong, and it's always fun to make your mom or dad wrong, catch them being wrong. I know this from experience.
Connor, you have about 5 minutes, just so you know.
Oh, thank you, Sky. Ask Sky to give me that verbal. The sixth session has to do with why some kids may engage in harmful or illegal sexual behavior with younger kids, and what are the contexts, babysitting and other contexts that are not monitored by adults, and how to handle situations so that they keep themselves from harming younger kids. We have, as I mentioned, content on responsible behavior with peers. And here in this session, we also talk about who are safe adults, how do you identify them so that you can go talk to them if you have concerns about your own behavior, the behavior of someone else, or the experiences of a younger child, and what to do if you see or suspect that abuse is happening to someone that you know. I mentioned that we've completed an NIH-funded randomized controlled trial. It was a small trial with 4 Baltimore City public schools, including the school, the K-8 that my own children go to, that I'm very proud of. That we were delighted to have partners in Baltimore City. We started out with focus groups, as I mentioned. We did a rapid prototyping process after the focus groups where we revised our content based on immediate feedback from kids, and then we launched an RCT with the intervention. And what we found is that there, first of all, middle school students and middle school parents and middle school educators really liked this intervention, which was great for us to hear. That's what we got from focus groups. And also after the intervention was done, we went back to educators who had been exposed to the intervention, and they really liked it. They gave us some great advice on how to revise it, but they enjoyed it. And then importantly, what we found was that relative to the control group, which got the intervention later, so we call that a waitlist control, kids who had received RBYC had demonstrated significantly more accurate knowledge about child sexual abuse, knowledge about related laws, and significantly more accurate knowledge about sexual consent. And I would say this is the real key point. They demonstrated higher, or they reported higher self-efficacy to avoid sexually harming younger children and to avoid peer sexual harassment, which, given that we didn't have a ton of content around peer sexual harassment, was a welcome and surprising finding. We got support from and buy-in from our school district because we were able to tie elements of RBYC to Maryland's mandated health education requirements. So that meant they could tick off some boxes by implementing this intervention. School administrators were supportive because they had been coming to us with, what do we do about problem sexual behavior among kids? And educators were supportive. They really liked the content, and in part they were supportive because in the context of our pilot trial, we delivered the intervention. We had intervention coaches. Ultimately, we want educators to be able to deliver it. That's much more cost effective and just much more feasible. But we also know that some educators are going to find some of this content difficult to deliver themselves, and we've got to figure out workarounds. And that's in part why we're trying to develop some more video content with this intervention. So next steps, we are adapting RBYC for kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we really need to do a much larger, like 40 schools or so, school-based randomized control trial to provide a better, bigger test of the efficacy of this intervention. And we are actively seeking funding for that larger trial right now. And so with that, I'll stop.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. Can you hear me all right? Am I yelling loud enough? Okay.
I hear you just fine.
Thank you for your presentation. There were a couple questions in the chat. So there was a question about the length of the session, and Luciana was able to answer that it's 45 minutes long. But related to this, maybe you could tell us about your experience approaching schools and their buy-in for the amount of time and the number of sessions, and then maybe how you could break down some of the barriers that you potentially could come up against.
Sure, and I appreciate that Amanda and Luciana are here to to correct anything that I might get wrong. You know, we have not had the experience of schools saying this is too burdensome for us and not wanting to engage around that. So you know, we're early days. We're approaching schools for the large scale trial, and we've gotten some enthusiastic responses. Right now, obviously, the real issue for schools is COVID and the pandemic, and I don't need to belabor that point. I think that when we look at what makes an effective prevention intervention, multi-session dosage is one of those elements that is absolutely key. So you have to have more than one session, and you need content delivered in multiple ways because kids learn in different ways, of course. And so it's important to have enough sessions, but it's obviously important to have not too many sessions because schools are already burdened by so many expectations, and we understand that. So we will be looking at ways to limit the content. Right now it's 8 sessions, 45 minutes. That's squeezing it down. It was actually 10 in our pilot trial, and we know that was too many. But you wouldn't want to get below 4, I don't think. And it may be that we need 6 or 8 sessions to really deliver this content in a way that changes behavior. Behavior change takes a little bit of effort. Again, I think when you can show schools that the intervention does something for them, it meets one of their needs. In this case, it meets 2. 1, again, it allowed the schools to check off some health education requirements that are mandated by the state. So that was really useful to us. And 2, schools know that sexual behavior is there, of course, and it's a problem. They don't know what to do, and we schools are trying so hard to avoid the prison pipeline, and so just calling law enforcement is just not going to be the right answer for this. So they're looking for solutions.
Great. So the next question is, for states where consent is not legally allowed to be discussed, do you have any suggestions about how to combat that, and then maybe the way that this program could change some minds?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. One, every state has its own law, which makes the U.S. a really challenging and unique place to do research like this, and having to do with anything that's forensic or potentially illegal. Most states figure out workarounds. So I will tell you, South Carolina, where I lived for 18 years and did a lot of research, South Carolina actually has one of the best rates of teaching kids about full sexual education, comprehensive sex education. Nobody knows that because they keep that stuff under the radar, but they have figured out how to work around some of the policies and norms, frankly, of the Deep South in a way that is really effective for kids. And so if a state has a law that says you're not allowed to talk about sexual consent with kids, that's where I talk about, that 4th step of the public health approach is adapting for regions. And so maybe you change the word consent in the intervention to something else, assent, for example. Now that's a workaround. What you really want to do, of course, is create buy-in with policymakers. You don't want someone out there who can come in and shut you down. And so you want to reach out to folks that you think are going to have concerns and try to get them on board. And again, it's about showing what the benefit is. Cost benefit is great if you can show it. That brings a lot of people on board. Benefits to kids in terms of preventing future behavior that can get them in prison for a long time, that can harm other kids, and so on. And you also, when you're developing an intervention and beginning to evaluate it and trying to get feedback on what works and what doesn't work, you don't go to the place where it's going to be the hardest to implement, right? So those might be, some of the later states that get an intervention that's helpful, because it takes time to develop those relationships with important stakeholders.
Agree. Yes. So one of the exciting things I think about this program are the activities that you send home with your teens to do with their parents. And I still like to get my mom, and make her wrong. So I'm on board with that.
God, it never ends.
No, it doesn't. But I'm wondering if you could just speak quickly about caregiver participation in that, and if you had any feedback from them.
Yeah, parents at the outset, when we told them we were going to do that, really stressed the fact that they are super busy, and please keep those light and easy and few and far between. And we did all that. We had one school of our 4 that had great parental participation in those. And then we had 3 schools that did not. So that's actually a component of the intervention that we are we are really reevaluating and redeveloping to try to improve the likelihood that kids will be able to get their caregivers, parents, or other caregivers really engaged in some conversations. Because what we want is for there to be a shared understanding, and also for families to have some shared understanding of rules around older kid, younger kid contact and behavior, and for parents to understand, one of the contexts in which sexual behavior of older kids with younger kids happens is when we leave them together, when we put teenagers in charge of younger kids. And we need caregivers to develop some comfort with saying, hey, remember, no touching penises and vaginas. And just to get them to be very comfortable, as they're comfortable saying, hey, you don't hit or kick or punch or tease your younger brothers or younger whomever. We also need them comfortable and really explicitly saying, we don't touch or, we don't touch their penises or vaginas, so we don't ask them to touch ours. And so that's, one of my ulterior motives in everything I do is to get people really comfortable with that language.
I know that about you. Perfect. So maybe just one last question. In your initial trial, could you speak to whether or not you assessed prior exposure with sexual abuse among your participants? And if not, or if so, regardless, can you maybe talk a little bit about how that prior experience would inform implementation or be considered with your results?
Right. So I should have mentioned at the outset an important piece is we took a very trauma-informed approach to developing the intervention, the materials after every session, and also after every assessment evaluation session as part of the trial. We provide a handout to each kid and to the educators that provides resources at the school, in the community, and in the state or in the nation, as the case may be, that kids and others can access if they have concerns about their own experiences, their own thoughts, or their own behaviors. So that's one thing we did. We absolutely know that having experienced child sexual abuse is a risk factor for future engaging in harmful sexual behavior. I want to be really clear. Most people who have experienced and survived child sexual abuse do not go on to commit sexual harm, but it is a very real risk factor, particularly for boys. And so we know that that's something that's very likely going to affect how people respond to RBYC. Our study had about 160 kids, so we were not powered. We didn't have the statistical power to really look at the impact of that particular potential moderator, nor did we assess actual behaviors, illegal sexual behaviors, because we wouldn't have been able to detect any change. We also had some real concerns by the Hopkins Institutional Review Board about asking kids about sexual behaviors, both experiences and victimization experiences and illegal behaviors. And we are working hard to get our IRB to understand that the harm is in not asking. The harm is in failing to do this kind of prevention research, failing to get evidence about the behaviors that you're trying to prevent, which is the only way we'll ever know if something works. And the harm of the failures to assess for really important factors such as prior exposure to child sexual abuse. So I think our IRB has started to come along, and we are continuing to work with them on those issues. It's not uncommon for IRBs to be very uncomfortable. Institutional review boards, which review research protocols, I should have said, it's not uncommon for people to be uncomfortable with this kind of research. Some people today may have been uncomfortable with my presentation or my language, but there are literally dozens of studies with millions of cases of kids who have gone through this kind of research and show that they are not harmed by being asked sensitive questions, and they actually enjoy being part of the solution. And so getting the adults to understand that is really key. I will say educators already get that. Educators already, by and large, as a group, seem to understand this is an important issue. Kids need to be part of the solution. We need to be able to talk with kids. But regulatory bodies, reviewers, these are folks that are very squeamish.
Wonderful. So I'll just remind everyone that we will have a period at the end of all of the talks today for a little bit more question and discussion. So if you want to, still percolate on some questions, you can put those in the chat and we'll continue to monitor. And then a question for Elizabeth and our other speakers. There has already been some interest in seeing slides. And so if you would be willing to share, if I can be the hub for those things. So I will drop my email in the chat and you can request those slides from me if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Dr. Letourneau, and for that great presentation and also for being really a true trailblazer in this field. You are synonymous with sexual abuse prevention. And so thanks for your dedication all these years. All right, we're now going to turn to a presentation by Kate Guastafaro. Kate is an assistant research professor at Penn State in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies, and also a member of the Child Maltreatment Solutions Network. And Kate's going to talk about a different program, a targeted program, and an example of how that might improve our understanding of primary prevention.
Great. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. As Jenny mentioned and started with her presentation, there are a number of different players, if you will, that play a role in the primary prevention of sexual abuse. Dr. Letourneau talked about the way in which children can be involved with this, but I'm focused specifically on the role that parents can play in the primary prevention of sexual abuse. And so parents are uniquely positioned to prevent sexual abuse in a number of different ways. First and foremost, they are the ones that communicate health and safety strategies, maybe in the form of family rules, like what's allowed. Like Elizabeth said, we don't touch penises and vaginas. That's a family rule. Parents also are able to observe child behaviors and any changes in those behaviors, and then recognize any potential danger cues. And Jenny mentioned this, but parents are the person who creates that protective environment for families and so for kids. And so we need to be sure that parents have the skills to do so. And then parents are responsible for the supervision of their children. So all of these things position them to prevent sexual abuse, yet parent-focused efforts have largely been ignored in sexual abuse prevention. There are some parent-focused sexual abuse prevention programs out there, so I do want to acknowledge that, but they're heavily didactic. So that means it's a lot like this, right? Somebody shows up and just talks at a parent. In contrast, we would want to see a behaviorally based program where parents get to learn those things, but then apply them. Some of these programs do use videos with actors to show a scenario, but the parent who is participating doesn't get to role play within it. So that's not the best practice in changing behaviors. Other parent-focused sexual abuse prevention programs are delivered as a complementary program alongside child-focused programs. So their child might receive a program within school, and then they're offered one, after school or at a parent-teacher night. The problem with that is that it's, of course, voluntary, and parents are busy, we know this. It would be very difficult to get them to come and attend that added session. So we see an extremely low participation rate among those programs that are offered alongside school-based programs. And altogether, the parent-focused sexual abuse prevention programs that are out there, we have some very mixed evidence. So we've heard loud and clear the value of evidence-based programs. And the existing programs out there, some have been evaluated, but not all of them. And those that have do not always have really significant findings demonstrating that evidence base. So a good start, but we might have some more to do. So let's talk about the bigger kind of prevention of child maltreatment. So that would include physical abuse, neglect, maybe emotional abuse, and also sexual abuse when we define child maltreatment broadly. These broad, generalized, parent-focused child maltreatment programs, there's a lot of them, and they're designed to teach parents about child development, what to expect, what to maybe look for if there are changes, to talk to a pediatrician. There's also been a lot of research to show that these parent-focused general child maltreatment programs increase positive parent-child interactions. There's some improvement in parent mental health and overall reduce problem child behaviors. So stated differently, those generalized parent-focused child maltreatment programs, we have seen a reduction of rates in physical abuse and neglect, but none of these programs directly target the risk factors for sexual abuse. And importantly, none have demonstrated an effect on rates of sexual abuse. So this could be an avenue to consider here. The gap that I'm presenting to you here is that we have a lack of effective parent-focused child sexual abuse prevention programs. We have a challenge in engaging parents in these programs, getting them to come to attend a different session, especially if it's multiple sessions. We don't really have an implementation infrastructure to support the dissemination of these programs. So who would be delivering this program to parents? We don't have an answer to that right now. And all of that taken together, there's a threat to the sustainability of these programs, meaning its viability and dissemination in the real world. Enter our team. We developed Smarter Parents, Safer Kids, and it was previously referred to as Smart Parents, Safe and Healthy Kids, but that's just a little bit of a mouthful, so Smarter Parents for short. This is designed to be added on to those general parent-focused child maltreatment programs that have evidence-based. So they've met that criteria, and the most common of those strategies are home visiting programs. So where the session happens in the home and delivered to parents of children, typically from birth to 5. So the example program there that I'll mention is Parents as Teachers. Our program, Smarter Parents, is designed to be delivered in one added session. So that's about 60 minutes, depending on how many kids are in the house and all of the other things that are going on. That might take a little bit longer, but for the most part, it happens within about 60 minutes, which is the typical session length. And our program adds sexual abuse prevention content in 3 areas that are common across parent education programs. And I'll explain this more on the next slide, but we focus on child development, parent-child communication, and child safety. So across all of those existing evidence-based child maltreatment programs, these 3 things are always talked about, but not specific to sexual abuse prevention. So that's where we're able to leverage that existing program to enhance prevention of sexual abuse. So Smarter Parents takes the existing sessions about child development, relationship skills, and safety, and enhances the content around sexual abuse prevention. So for example, parents in the general parent education program are going to learn about child development, motor development, cognitive development, social emotional, but they don't have any content about sexual development. And so that's where we come in. We provide information about the developmental trajectory, normative and non-normative sexual developmental milestones. So that's how we're kind of enhancing what they've already learned. When it comes to the parent-child interactions and that relationship, these existing programs spend a lot of time talking about age-appropriate activities and how to facilitate communication between the parent and the child. But where we're adding is specifically about the communication regarding sex, sexual behaviors, sexual development, sexual abuse. So we are giving parents age-appropriate language to help them talk to their kids about these topics. And some of those things, my favorite one that we focus on is where to have those conversations. And, you know, little tip here, if you ever need to talk to your child about a hard topic, specifically maybe about their sexual development, the car seems to be a very popular place because everyone's buckled in and can't escape the conversation. Lastly, the last part that we focus on is safety related to the risk of sexual abuse. So in the parenting program, they could talk about things like car seat safety or hazards within the home, but we're focusing specifically about safety factors related to sexual abuse. So for example, that might include how to vet babysitters or people with whom parents leave their children, giving parents the language for questions to ask a babysitter or someone at a daycare, that they can even ask for a background check. Those are kind of things that we strategize in that part. We also talk about monitoring children's behavior inside the home as well as outside of the home. And I think maybe the part that I'm most excited about, or one of the parts that I really love in the safety portion, is our screen time safety content. And so we're focused on how to help parents understand how kids are accessing things on the internet and who might be accessing them. So these are the three areas that we focus on. And I just want to say that we used a very similar developmental process as Elizabeth spoke about. We took all of the existing that we could find parent-focused sexual abuse prevention content out there, distilled it into a document, and then presented it to an expert panel on which Dr. Letourneau served. And we used that to kind of boil down to the basic tenets of sexual abuse prevention that we could teach parents. And importantly, we needed those elements to be aligned with the parent programs. So that was kind of our development process. So let me tell you how our work is filling that gap and addressing those points that I mentioned earlier. So I said that we have a lack of effective parent-focused sexual abuse prevention programs, but we do have an existing plethora of child maltreatment programs that parents are in and that are effective. And what we're doing is adding sexual abuse prevention content to those effective programs. We are enhancing parent engagement in these programs because they're already enrolled in the parent education program that Smarter Parents is added onto. And we deliver all of this content. It sounds like a lot, I know. We do all of that in just one added session because they're already receiving all of those other elements in the sessions of the parent program. There's a built-in implementation infrastructure, right? These parent education programs are already implemented via the child welfare system. So I already have a mechanism to disseminate the program. And then the sustainability of this is that there's federal funding for parent education programs such as McV or Family First, which can support the sustainability of this program. So again, I'm just going to kind of back up to tell you how this works. The parent will have received elements of the parent education program. We work with that program to identify the place at which it makes sense for this added session to be added. That's important because I need parents to already have a baseline knowledge about child development, about communication, and about child safety. Then I enhance that baseline knowledge, that foundation specifically around sexual abuse prevention. So once they receive this added session, then they continue back in their normal sessions with the parent educator in the parent education program. So it's this one-time sexual abuse prevention session, but they're continued to be supported after that. So here are the results of our initial pilot trial. And, similar to how you heard Elizabeth present her stages of development here, this was a randomized trial where we looked at the effectiveness of the added module on when it's added to parents as teachers compared to parents as teachers as usual. And so these findings on the left are showing you the awareness related measure. So that's, do parents know about sexual abuse? Do they know what to do kind of broadly? And you see the dark line on top, that's the group that got the added session. That's significantly higher than parents as teachers as usual, and those gains were maintained over time. On the right side, you see the results of the intention to use protective behaviors. And similarly, the dark line on top, the group that had parents as teachers plus our session, had a significant increase in their intention to use protective behaviors, and that gain was maintained over time. So this demonstrates that the added session works in changing parents' sexual abuse related knowledge and intention to use protective behaviors. In this trial, we also wanted to kind of check a couple other findings. Because we are adding a session to an already established evidence-based program, we needed to make sure that adding that didn't impact negatively that other parenting program. And so by measuring general parenting knowledge and skills throughout, we were able to demonstrate that the added session didn't impact parents' general parenting knowledge. And then because, as we've heard from Elizabeth, talking about sexual abuse can be kind of difficult, we wanted to be sure that those who were delivering the session had the right kind of attitudes and felt confident in the delivery of the program. And so we measured provider attitudes and self-efficacy from training all the way through implementation. And of course, at the beginning, the providers were wary. They were like, you want me to do what in what session? They weren't really worried about the content, but it was more about the logistics of delivering it. As they became more familiar with it and they delivered it more and more, virtually all of that wariness and trepidation was eliminated. So the more that they did it, the more comfortable they became. And this kind of alludes to the fact that we had really high acceptability among the providers who delivered the program. They felt that there was a real need for this content and they were excited to deliver it. So where we stand at the moment with Smarter Parents is that we know it works. Yes, it was a small trial, but we know that it works. We know that parents like it, and we know that providers like it. So next up on our agenda, similar to Elizabeth, we are planning and actively seeking funding for a larger trial where we will replicate that effectiveness on a larger scale in a nationally disseminated program. Some of the lingering questions about this type of work, given the additive approach, is how we might measure fidelity, meaning the degree to which the program is delivered as designed, and how to translate the intention of using behaviors to actual use of those behaviors. So those are kind of some open areas that we are working on and look forward to adding to our knowledge. I think that we also have an opportunity to explore adding this module to other parent education programs. We've had, great interest from other programs, and how to make that work with their implementation infrastructure is something that we need to have a little thought about. And what I've described to you falls within that targeted prevention approach that Jenny went over at the beginning. So there could be the need, I would argue that there's definitely the need to develop a universal approach to this as well. And of course, the age-old issue here is that we have to identify sustainable means for funding this program, which could include bringing in other systems. So that was a lot. And I would just encourage you to follow along on Twitter. We actively put out our work and what we're doing. So you can follow me or our project at Safe and Healthy PA for updates.
Thank you so much, Kate, for that really nice overview of the program and your approach not only to the program, but your attention to the implementation issues, which, something that is often sloughed over and overlooked when we think about the realities of delivering these programs. So we have time for a couple of questions as they come through the chat. But why don't you start with a few things that you could, clarify a little bit. And one is, how long was the follow-up in the randomized controlled trial? And then how do you think about this single session issue that Elizabeth brought up in her talk?
Yep. So the follow-up in our initial randomized trial was just 1 month post receipt of the intervention. That frankly had to do just with study timeline. It would of course be ideal to follow that longer term, and that's something we plan to do in the next study. When it comes to the single session point that Elizabeth made, I think it's a good one. I argue that our approach is able to be delivered in one session and to be successful because we are leveraging a program that has multiple sessions already. We are just enhancing this one session to be focused about sexual abuse. I think that there's, well, let me say, I look forward to studying if and how much providers have to reinforce some of these concepts over time with their families, and maybe something that, we might call like a booster session as the child gets older. But we are leveraging this long relationship between parent and parent educator within this parenting program to be able to do all of this in just one session.
And leveraging those foundational skills that are already taught in the multiple sessions,
yeah,
as well. Oh, that's great, Kate. And then what is your approach to changing behaviors and assessing behavior change, like either now or in the future? Like, how are we thinking about this? Because we know that matters.
Yes, it does matter. And it is a challenging question, because the fact of the matter is that there is a relatively low base rate of child sexual abuse. There, of course, one case is too many, but this is not something that everybody will for sure experience. That's a good thing. That makes the ability to assess behavior change a little bit difficult. So we have to come up with some creative ways to measure actual behavior change. And there are not many or any existing measures that do this. And so our team has developed what we call a behavioral interview, where we're going to ask, what rules have you changed in the house, or what names do you use to refer to private parts? We want them to be using the anatomical names and not nicknames, right? And the other part of this is that parents will have the opportunity to use those behaviors not just with their own child, but with any child in their life. And so some of the questions that we ask on this behavioral interview will be about, have you asked about the one-on-one policies at your child's school or after school center? So that's bigger than just about their child. So it is an open area that we are trying to help move forward, I think.
Great. And then, Kate, what's the ideal age to deliver this intervention, and how does the curriculum address different ages?
So we are, the curriculum is designed to provide content for parents of children from birth through age 13. However, because we are at the moment working within home visiting programs where the children of the parents who receive the program are typically 0 to 5, that's the age that we are currently working in. Right? But children get older. And so when parents are able to provide these foundational prevention, strategies from an early age, it reduces the likelihood that the child will experience these things in the future, and or when and if they do, they'll have the relationship with their parent to talk about it. So we are focused right now on parents of 0 to 5, but that doesn't mean that's where we stop. It's just our starting point. And I think, as I alluded to, we'll look at other parenting programs that could serve parents of children that are older as well.
Thank you, Kate. That's great. And then another question is, what do we know about the risk that might lead us to target particular groups of parents for this kind of targeted intervention?
So that's yes, and I apologize for not making this clearer. We adopt the perspective that when I deliver this session, I do not think that you as a parent would ever harm your child, but my job is to help you to create that protective environment. And so this certainly comes from the primary prevention perspective in that regard. And there is literature that indicates children of parents who are enrolled in these parent education programs are at a slight, increased risk for experiencing sexual abuse. And so that again is not because the parent would do anything to their child necessarily, but it's about that environment. And so we are leveraging their involvement with the parent education program to prevent the possibility of sexual abuse.
And then there's one last question here, I think, about parents as teachers in general, and do all PAT programs receive this information, or does each state have to request it? So maybe talk a little bit about your relationship with Parents as Teachers National and moving forward with them on larger dissemination.
Yep, I have been very, very lucky to have partnered with the Parents as Teachers National Center for my entire career. And they're one of the most responsive models, in my opinion, and they see that their parents and that their providers want and need this information. So I'm very lucky that they agree with my perspective and are supportive. So at the moment, our program is still being evaluated. So at this time, Parents as Teachers sites are not all getting this information. I hope with all of my being that is the future of this work. And I think that Parents as Teachers National is on board with that perspective, but we need to demonstrate the science before we can roll this out on the bigger scale. And then, there are a lot more questions that come with that scale up and dissemination of the program. And so stay tuned, I think, is my ending comment with that.
Right. And then one last point to be made here, I think, and that's about leveraging even additional systems. So not just the child welfare system, but an idea here in the chat by Iris Beckwith to leverage the school system to even reach more parents when we're talking about maybe that standalone universal approach. So what ideas or how have you been thinking about, leveraging the school system as well?
Well, Iris, you are right on it. We are actively pursuing this, and I'm in the process of adapting this added approach to be universal. And the idea with that, I have to kind of figure out that baseline level of knowledge that I'm relying on from the parent education program, how that plays into the universal approach. If they're not already receiving those baseline skills, what do I need to give the parent in the universal setting? So that's the question I'm working on right now. We do have this vision that it will be implemented alongside school-based programs. And I'll just say that there is for those who are in Pennsylvania, there is an open request for proposals through the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency along these lines. And I recognize that we're out of time right now, but if you are interested in that, I'd be happy to engage with you, email and connect you with my colleagues who I see on this call from PCCD about that effort.
Right, and then one last point before our break about moving to the U.S. Military Family Advocacy Program system, and that's also something that our partners, such as Danny Perkins and his team here at the Clearinghouse for Military Families, are partnering on now, and hope to see that as another system, yet another system to help leverage some of these universal and targeted programs. So thank you for that. Unless there are any more questions, we have a break here scheduled, precious and limited. So let me introduce Lisa Saldana to everyone. Lisa is a senior scientist at Oregon Social Learning Center and joins us from Oregon. She was going to be here in person, but that got changed due to this new uptick in COVID. So thanks for getting up so early and being prepared to do this, Lisa, and you can take it away.
Thank you. Absolutely. I am delighted to be here, although I am very disappointed that I wasn't able to see folks in person, especially some of the friendly faces or friendly names that I see on the screen. It would have been nice to connect with people, but I am happy to be here with you guys virtually. Okay, so I was asked to speak with you guys today about implementation within the child welfare system. And so that's what we're going to be focused on. So a little bit of a change of topic from what we have been discussing, but of course, this is all within the context of having us help to figure out how it is that we can implement these programs that we've been talking about this morning, as well as others that might be advantageous to the youth that we're discussing. To begin with, I just want to get us on the same page. I just added this slide actually at the break because I wanted to make sure that we were all speaking a shared language with one another. And so when we're talking about implementation, or when I'm talking about implementation, really what I'm talking about is the top of this triangle here. Oftentimes we use the words diffusion or dissemination interchangeably with implementation, and they actually there are subtle differences between them. And implementation, again, what I'm going to be focused on is really the processes that we put into place to make interventions happen, to actually make them get on the ground. Dissemination is more, we talk about it with our stakeholder groups, or we might talk about it in venues such as this, where we're giving presentations. We're letting people be aware of them. And then diffusion is sort of like we do something and we passively let it take hold, sort of like we joke in our field a lot about like iPhone products, right? You don't really have to do much for them. They get released and then they get adopted right away. Unfortunately, for the types of interventions that we're talking about, that is not the case. And so we really need to put some special things in place to make it happen. Okay, so the child welfare context that we've been talking about today, it's really important when we're talking about implementation to consider the context in which we're implementing. I think no surprise to anybody on this call, the child welfare system is an incredibly stressed system. And so when we're talking about that, we're talking about not just the youth and families that are being served, as we've been discussing this morning, but also the workforce. And so the environment in which we are trying to engage with our partners or install these different efforts, we're asking folks who are incredibly burdened, working with a really high risk, population. Again, I think all of you guys all know this, to then do one more thing by adopting an evidence-based practice. We also know that within the child welfare system, that staff, by and large, I know everybody tries really hard, but there are just a lot of individuals and a lot of different degrees of variation across our federal system. And so we have staff that don't necessarily have adequate training, and we have staff that really struggle sometimes. It's not their area of expertise to be developing these evidence-based practices and then implementing them. And so we're trying to do this within the context of the workforce issues they are already struggling with: poor supervision, low resources, overwhelmed work schedules. And then our child welfare system, I think, again, familiar to folks on the call, but it is structured somewhat like this in sort of a hierarchical structure. Of course, every system is different. We have our county-driven systems and our state-driven systems, but by and large, we have some sort of this hierarchy where there's this top of the chain, and then we have it filter down to the staff and eventually, reaching the children, the youth and families that we're serving. But when we think about implementation and we think about the decision of the programs that we are adopting and the methods or how it is that we are going to adopt those decisions are often made by the upper levels of this hierarchy. So made by the individuals who won't actually be involved in the boots on the ground efforts or be involved in receiving the intervention and to see how it's working for the families on the ground. They don't get that feedback until those outcomes actually are starting to be produced. So that's just, again, something to think about when we're thinking about context. So then, currently, I think no surprise to anybody, the achievement of health equity is something that is currently being really pushed in child welfare, but in also all of our public serving systems. And so what can implementation science really kind of bring to the table to help us to be able to achieve this goal? So elements of IS that can really help support the advancement of health equity include our focus on implementing from the beginning as we are developing our interventions and designing our interventions in the mind, not just for the populations that we are reaching, but also for those low resource sort of context. And again, with implementation in mind, with who it is that we are going to reach and the implementation strategies that might be necessary. And so this is where implementation process models really come in, which is my area of expertise. And so implementation process models really are designed to help us be able to break things down into small steps and look at them in sort of a temporal sequence to see how is it that we can get programs to not just be launched, but also make it all the way to the end of the implementation continuum where we achieve sustainment. And so we can see that here. This is a slide Hendricks Brown and colleagues have put together that is, the focus of this is not the way I'm going to be using this, this particular slide. The focus of what they're talking about is they're talking about the development of the differences between basically effectiveness trials and implementation trials. And what I like to do is actually think about these things together and these concepts together. So on the left-hand side is how we traditionally think about our effectiveness work. And this really maps on to what we've heard this morning thus far. I think Kate just provided a really, really nice example of how we do intervention development and sort of those efficacy studies, and then looking at them in the real world with our effectiveness work. So oftentimes that's where we sort of think traditionally about our intervention development. And then after we have our interventions developed, we then pop over to the right-hand side of the slide where we have that yellow box, which are our implementation process. Won't go into all of this detail, but that is the EPIS model there in the yellow box. That's exploration, preparation, implementation, and sustainment. It's a model by Greg Ahrens and colleagues that I really follow closely with my team. What I would like to encourage us to do is instead to think of this together, to think of this as a full continuum, not as two separate segments of intervention development, but rather how can we move these programs into practice much more quickly by thinking about implementation from the beginning, from the get-go, and what can we learn from these intervention development experiences? Well, one of the things that we know from this left-hand side of the slide is that how we kind of move up in the steps here of the intervention development process is by focusing on fidelity. And so I like to think about how can we take what we've learned from that intervention development side and apply those same principles and strategies to our implementation side. So again, implementation being making it happen. How can we make sure that we're making this happen in a way that we are still being true to the intervention? So we want to really balance the intervention and implementation fidelity needs. I think the concept of intervention development or fidelity is something that folks are pretty familiar with. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we understand the key ingredients to an intervention, what makes it work, what's sort of the secret sauce or the building blocks in there to help us achieve those key clinical outcomes that you see in the trials. We also know that, again, as we discussed this morning, that often these interventions are designed for targeted populations. Well, similarly, then, we want to think about what makes an implementation work. So I have said many, many times, if anybody's heard me speak before, that it is easy, although it's not super easy, but it is easy to start a program. Anybody can start a program. It is incredibly difficult to start a program where you're implementing with the infrastructure underneath it to implement a quality program that is being delivered with fidelity and then able to achieve positive clinical outcomes to sustain. So just because we start a program doesn't mean we sustain it. And so again, when we think about implementation, we now want to think about not the targeted population, but the targeted context. And so again, this parallel process between implementation and intervention. But there is this push-pull then. There's this, we hear a lot, I've heard it this morning already in terms of how do we really balance this need to maintain intervention fidelity, those key concepts or the secret sauce to the intervention, when we are also feeling the need or this push to really make modifications or adaptations to that intervention so that it fits within the context. Well, I would argue that one of the ways that we are able to mitigate that risk is through the use of strong implementation fidelity. And I'll describe that in just a second. I also want to make really clear, though, that when we're talking about, or when I'm talking about adaptation, I'm talking about changing the secret sauce. And so changing those key elements. So for example, Kate was mentioning earlier in her presentation about adding a new module to an existing intervention. That indeed is an adaptation. On the other hand, if there were something where the intervention was pretty much the same, but maybe the pictures were being changed, the language was being changed to be able to meet a specialty population's need, well, we would say that that's a customization or a modification, not necessarily an adaptation. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page when we're thinking about that as well. So from my perspective, and the work that I really focus on is how can we decrease the need for intervention adaptation by instead making sure that we hold really true to our implementation fidelity. And part of that, and the key to being able to do this, is really focused on pre-implementation. I am not going to go into all of the background that my team and I have worked on in terms of really identifying the value of pre-implementation, but I am going to introduce it here, and I'm happy to talk about it further with anybody who might have interest. So my team and I have developed what is called the Stages of Implementation Completion, or the SIC. And the SIC is an 8-stage process model that is being utilized to track currently just shy of 2,000 implementations worldwide. And what we are doing is we are using this particular process model to, one, track implementations, but because we are tracking all these implementations, we're building this ever-growing repository of data that is being collected about different types of implementations, different types of projects, different service sectors, different populations being served. And what we have found is that there is true consistency across all of these different contexts and environments and what is necessary to really implement an intervention well. So we have 3 phases: pre-implementation, which is what I'm really focused on here today, which is the engagement stage, assessment of feasibility. Is it feasible for a particular context to be able to adopt an intervention well? And then the readiness planning stage, getting the boots on the ground, the nuts and bolts in place to be able to implement well. You then go into the active implementation phase where you're, actually hiring, training your staff, getting your fidelity monitoring in place, launching your program, delivering your ongoing services, all with the goal of hopefully achieving delivery of this intervention well, competently, to open the door for sustainment. Within each of these 8 stages, there are a whole different range of different activities that need to be completed. These activities, when we do our work and we make adaptations of the SIC or customizations, depending on the context that we're working in, and when we do that, we really are customizing the activities. We have then some core activities, though, that we refer to as our universal activities that we have found that are essential across all different implementations. There are 46 of these activities. I know that this font is really small. My intention is not for you to see the measure, but instead for you to see that the number of activities within stages, there are only 5 stages shown on the slide here of the 8, but to see that there are not a whole bunch, right? And so these are the core stages. So for instance, in engagement, there are 4 key engagement activities that we find across different implementations. Here for staff hiring and training, there are these 5 key activities that we know are essential. This is not to say that these are the only activities to implement. And so for your particular intervention, there might be a range of other activities, but we really have shown consistently that if you adhere to these core activities and you deliver them well or competently, so just like we're talking about with intervention delivery, that if we are able to do that and so implement with high fidelity, that we are able to successfully get programs to sustain. And so when we need to cut back because of resource limitations, et cetera, in an intervention, we would want to make sure that we are including these sort of key activities. And again, I'm happy to make these available to anybody who would be interested. But one of the most important things that come out of this is for us that we see these different consistencies of the mechanisms of action for what makes the implementation work, sort of like what makes it tick over time. And again, not surprising, I'm sure, to anybody on this call, is that the use of stakeholder engagement is absolutely essential. This has been really interesting during this time of COVID. I've had a number of folks talk to me about how can they implement successfully in the absence of stakeholder engagement. And basically what my recommendation has been is that you can't. And so instead what we've needed to do during COVID, and I think we've all done it well, today's an example of it, is pivot and figure out how can we engage with our stakeholders in a different way, in different formats, but ignoring it is not an option, because we know that our stakeholder engagement helps us maintain not just our intervention fidelity that everybody talks about, but also our implementation fidelity. So here we have stakeholders represented in the engagement stage, here in the feasibility stage, we have a stakeholder meeting, and also in the readiness planning stage. So all 3 of those stages of pre-implementation. And I'm going to provide a case example from one of the programs that I've developed. So although I am an implementation scientist and really focus on implementation process, I also have the good fortune of wearing a different hat as an intervention developer and have developed several interventions that are specifically targeting the child welfare system. So I'm going to take you through not the intervention, but the implementation of pre-implementation of one of my interventions. So this one is called FAIR, the Families Actively Improving Relationships Program. And this is a complex intervention. It's a multi-component intervention for families who are involved in the child welfare, particularly where parental methamphetamine or opioid use has been identified. This is the product of a K award that I received soon after graduating. And so this has been work in development for approximately 10 years, but we are now at the point where we are scaling up FAIR beyond our trials. So again, to begin with, very important. I knew from the get-go and had the good fortune, Elizabeth, who you guys heard from this morning, and I used to work together at the Medical University of South Carolina, where we both really were immersed in learning to develop these complex interventions. And one of the things that was very apparent to me at that point in time is that idea of thinking about implementation from the start. And so FAIR is a complex, multifaceted intervention, as I mentioned, but it also requires flexible scheduling, non-traditional treatment sessions, and engagement with these really difficult to engage families. So parents, again, who are using substances that have been referred to the child welfare system. Large portion of them have their children in foster care, not surprisingly. And so these are families that are really, really challenging to engage. In addition, so we have these complex intervention components, but we also have these really complex sort of implementation components that are essential for the intervention to get off the ground. It's essential that we partner with DHS, with child welfare, with our community partners, but in particular for this intervention, it is absolutely essential that we develop community partnerships with providers, with service agencies, because this is a program that relies very much on what we call contingency management. So the use of incentives to reward and to incentivize positive behavior change. This is something that we know is really effective in treating substance use, but we also know that it is a very costly intervention. So what we did is we designed our intervention to where we were not using direct dollars to provide these incentives, but instead what we do is we rely on community donations and community partnerships to be able to provide incentives in the community that are free to the program and free to the participants. We then follow those. So we have this really complex process. This here, what we have is what we call our SICK roadmap. So this is our implementation roadmap. That SICK that I had mentioned to you before, the 8 stages that have all of those different activities, we then operationalize that for what it is that we are trying to intervene on or to get implemented with our intervention. And here we can see, so under all of these different activities, they then get broken down. So for example, in readiness planning, this again is customized specifically for FAIR. So for that intervention I'm talking about right now, we know that part of the funding plan review, it's not just coming up with your funding plan, but you got to contract with Medicaid. You got to get, this is a community outreach home visiting program. So we need to figure out mileage estimates. How far of a catchment area can we include that we're going to be able to establish our cost effectiveness of our intervention delivery. So all of these are the sorts of things that we are determining from the get-go before we're even talking to a particular site. But then I'm going to give you an example of our current scale-up efforts here in Oregon. And so because of the fact that we have, we've established effectiveness of FAIR, we've established, consistent positive outcomes for the families that we're working with. And so that's gotten the attention of some individuals who are really interested in how can we scale this up in our communities. So one of the things is, again, so here we're thinking at the 6 stage 1, that engagement stage. So pre-implementation, we can go through a parallel process, which in fact is parallel to what we do in our intervention also. The FAIR model definitely uses a parallel process in the intervention strategies that are utilized. And we also do that for our implementation. So we start off with at the state or the system level, working with the state to sort of decide what are their needs, what are their area of need. What we did is we spent about a year-long effort with Oregon State, the state of Oregon's DHS department, working not with their, so yes, it was with their top leadership who was driving the questions, but we were actually working with their data analytics group. And what we were doing is we were trying to identify, given the fact that Oregon itself is a state that is really, really suffered and challenged with methamphetamine and opioid use, where was it that we were going to be able to target to be able to make the biggest impact on the system, so that the system could then take some of their resources to divert it to some of the other areas. So how can we alleviate some of the stress on the child welfare system in their most challenging areas or regions? And the state themselves identified these 3 districts. The state is divided up into districts. Each district has multiple counties. So within these 3 districts is where they identified there was the greatest need. Well, then the state steps out of this engagement process a little bit, and now we go in and we are engaging with the county leadership of each of these different regions. So now the county leadership is taking on more of the implementation efforts. And what we want to do is, it was so interesting to hear some of the earlier talks. I think Elizabeth was talking about you start where you know that you're going to be able to make some changes most quickly. And that's exactly what we did, is we wanted to find our sort of flagship site where we were going to be able to have these folks be a model for the rest. And then with our provider clinics, what we did is we established other programs as we slowly are scaling this out in this region. So we don't do it all at once, because again, the system is originally who's involved more, then they back up a little bit. Now we have the county system that takes on a little bit more of this effort. And then the county and the provider clinics are working together. I will tell you, finding the provider clinics was incredibly challenging. So we had counties that are super interested. They have this high need. They want to do this, but they also are very opinionated about who are the organizations that they are and are not willing to work with, and who are we then, as the implementers, are trying to decide, of those ones that they are willing to work with, which context is the best for us to be able to implement these programs. Again, with the idea being that we want to build this infrastructure, because we don't want to build these just for the short term or just for like an evaluation. This is ideally for a long-term scale up effort, so that these are going to be services that are provided in the community. So then after this point, we've now moved on to stage 2. And if you recall, stage 2 is feasibility planning. And so with feasibility, what we want to do is at this point, the system and the county and the provider, the county and the provider clinics are working together, but the county is still sort of driving it. Is it going to be feasible to work with this provider agency? Are they going to, provide the types of referrals that we're interested in? Are they going to actually help us address this problem? And then the provider agencies are also involved, though. Yes, they're responding to these questions. When we then get to stage 3, so readiness planning, we then reverse this. And what we see is, again, now this you see the bar, this county level system is less involved. And for readiness planning, it is now full on at the clinic level. And so the clinics are now the ones that are really driving this, the readiness plan. They're the ones who are conducting the stakeholder meetings. They're inviting their DHS partners to those meetings, and they are now reporting out or disseminating, using that word dissemination, disseminating about the program to the child welfare agencies and different constituents as we are getting our things like our referrals in place. So these are those first 3 stages of implementation. This here is just, I just wanted to show you guys how we track this. So we have an online system where we track all of these different implementation activities that are taking place. What I'm not showing here, because I thought it'd be too confusing, is that then there are benchmarks associated with this, so that we can sort of predict how on track our different implementations are and provide correction to our sites to be able to, again, kind of guide them towards success. What we see here is that these 3 top sites that we have that we're implementing here in Oregon are doing well. They've completed 100% proportion of their pre-implementation activities. But we also see this 4th site, so same state system, different county system where they're struggling a little bit more. They're slower, right? So the pace, the amount of time that they're taking in their implementation is what we say they're in the red, right? We use a red, yellow, and green system. And then we also say that they have not been implementing as many of those activities as we would like to see. So we'll see how they'll do in the end. But we do, with the most important thing is that we have launched programs in each of those 4 sites. So there are families that are receiving this evidence-based practice throughout these different county and communities. So then just very briefly, I was also asked to think about, well, what does this mean in terms of cost? And so we have another tool. It's called the Cost of Implementing New Strategies, or the COINS tool. And the COINS tool maps directly onto the SIC, or onto the stages of implementation completion. So all of those different implementation activities, we want to think about that stakeholder engagement, those stakeholder engagement activities. Those have real cost to them. And I know that when we first started doing this work, I would hear folks say like, oh, well, the cost of a stakeholder meeting is, it's not that much. We'll do it at our conference room, so we don't have to rent space, and we'll just, get some bagels and coffee. It won't be that much. But in fact, a stakeholder meeting is incredibly expensive. The time and the cost of the people around the table that are gathering in that room. There's the loss of what they could be doing instead. And then there's also things like travel costs, et cetera. So a stakeholder meeting alone can be an incredibly expensive meeting, but so can all of these other activities. And so the COINS tool really helps us to capture both these direct and indirect costs, and allows us to be able to look at the cost of the implementation over and above the cost of the intervention. So often what happens, a child welfare agency is interested in adopting one of these programs. They're given the price of the intervention, but they're not given the cost of the implementation. And so that's where my work really falls in. And so what we are able to do with the COINS tool is we are able to weigh the difference between the hours, the sort of personnel or man hours that go into an implementation, and then also the direct costs that go into delivering that particular intervention. And I have worked with many, many sites where that then is what they're able to weigh the odds on. Like, so it might be that there's a low resourced site that does not have the financial capacity to be able to bring on a high cost intervention, but they have time, and they have time and they value bringing in something. And so this is where we might find something that might be a little bit less costly direct cost, but have really high personnel needs. But then that, the reverse might be true for somebody else. So then finally, my final point here, though, is that for prevention, there is a real challenge. What we have found in our work, we have a version of a pre-FAIR preventative version. And what we found in my work, and this is shared by others, is that quite honestly, the child welfare system is a reactive system. It is a responsive system to crisis. And so getting interventions that are preventative within the child welfare system is incredibly challenging, simply because that does not meet the immediate need of this crisis-driven, very, very stressed system. And so I think that's really where our next sort of venture needs to go, is how can we make this more valuable to that system, so that indeed these awesome preventative interventions that we've heard about this morning are able to be fully implemented. So in sum, we know that scale up within the child welfare system should consider the stressed context. We know that fidelity to the implementation process can help prepare us for these complex interventions and really help us to develop that infrastructure to maintain fidelity to the intervention so that we get those key core components. That stakeholder engagement is essential, and it's just one example of many that are really essential for the implementation process across service sectors. But for child welfare in particular, stakeholder engagement is essential. The resources that we need to implement the interventions really need to consider those costs. And then finally, the scale up of prevention offers additional challenges in operating within this system of crisis. So just to thank my SIC team, my FAIR team, and then my workforce development team. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That was wonderful as always. We have a couple questions. One, it's mine, and I'm going to ask it first because I get to do that. The point you made about that it takes time to bring sites on board and that slow rollout.
Yes.
Could you put some numbers to that slow rollout? Like, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the question. And so we've spent a lot of time, and I've been trying to get the word out, particularly to funders, because I know one of our biggest challenges is that we don't have the luxury of the time that we necessarily know empirically is needed to do this thorough job. What we have found is that it takes a minimum, basically the fastest pace, Kate, that you can implement an intervention and have it sustain, again, not start up, but sustain, is 2 months. And so we really want a minimum of 2 months of that pre-implementation process. What we also know is that in the engagement phase that I was talking about, in that engagement phase, if they engage and make a decision basically in 3 days or less, it's too fast. And so really we want to make sure that there's thought going into it, that they've had the time to be able to consider what it means for their context. And most importantly, that they are including all of the key decision makers within their system in that decision. We've been able to analyze empirically when decisions are made by the top leadership only and not involving sort of the middle leadership. And when that happens, those programs also most often do not go on to sustain.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I appreciate all of your work to make those parameters known. So another question is, what advice might you have for provider agencies who wish to implement programs where there is no fidelity monitoring supports from the program developers? And in that same vein, that agency might not have the resources for the larger SIC kind of approach.
Yeah, no, excellent, excellent question. So this again is something that we've had the privilege of being able to investigate with just a few programs, but they are child welfare oriented programs. And what we find is that when there is no fidelity monitoring in place by the developers or you know, like that's part of the program, that is very, as you can imagine, problematic. We had one study, in fact, where the developers, after they saw the outcomes, they have now gone back and created fidelity monitoring as part of their procedures because they did see that incredible voltage drop in the success without that fidelity monitoring. And so for folks that don't have that, what I always recommend is finding some sort of a bench for you, for your particular provider agency. What is your optimum goal that you're going for, so that we can identify, first of all, is this intervention the right fit to get you to that goal? But then what are your own internal sort of milestones or benchmarks that you want to work towards? It's incredibly, incredibly important to have intermediary milestones, because if we're only looking at the end, that gets really frustrating and discouraging for your staff that are working really hard. And so I would think about things like number of clients served within a certain time period, perhaps looking at even provider report. I mean, again, not knowing exactly what this intervention is, but looking at provider report around family or youth engagement with the intervention. So some really basic but key and important indicators of whether or not this is being accepted by the population, I think would be a nice step. And then as you get to know the program and your providers are doing it, then I could see you might come up with some, again, very small, light touch indicators around looking at improvement of the clinical improvement of your population. And although what I just said sounds like it's pretty burdensome, that would be something that myself or somebody else could probably help your provider agency get off the ground with low resources, like in terms of money, but then also trying to make it very, very low burden for your clinic population, which is key. It's essential to be low burden.
Great. And I will acknowledge that we do have several more questions in the chat, but I'm going to hold those for our Q&A period at the end, just to make time for our next speaker. So thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Fantastic presentation, Lisa. Really value your expertise here. Thank you for devoting your time. Our next up is Dr. Catherine Bradshaw. Dr. Bradshaw is a professor and Senior Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development at the University of Virginia School of Education and Human Development. And with that, I will let Dr. Bradshaw take it away.
Great. Are you guys seeing this in presentation mode?
No, you got to do that switch again.
Okay, there we go. Are we ready?
Yep.
Great, thank you. It's funny how we do Zoom, but every time it's a little bit different on every single interface. But I'm thrilled to be here and catch up with you all. I have quite a few friends and colleagues at Penn State in the Prevention Center, so hopefully some of these ideas will resonate with the team there, and really excited to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing in this space. I will acknowledge most of my work is in school-based settings, and so it's kind of a nice follow-up to Lisa's presentation, thinking about the different contexts when we talk about scale up and implementation. And so I wanted to also start off a little bit with this kind of prevention research cycle. And we've heard through the presentations this morning, kind of the process that folks are going through, especially Kate and Elizabeth and others. I happen to be on Elizabeth's broader team, so I got to be part of her team in developing the school-based programming. But, you know, where is this field of child sexual abuse prevention? We've clearly moved from step 1 to step 2, you know, identifying the problems and the prevalence. We've really identified risk and protective factors. But it was interesting that the conversations this morning were a little bit more focused on kind of the step 3 and step 4. How do we design these models? And then how do we really determine whether they're effective, and kind of, and there's a lot of discussion of scale up. And I really want to kind of pause this conversation on some level, because when we're thinking about developing certain interventions, it's really critical to be thinking about scale up from the get-go. I think unfortunately our field has kind of developed these Rolls-Royce interventions, and then we're like, okay, this worked in this setting, but now I really want to roll it up. And sometimes we have to make so many changes to a model to really make it scalable that it often looks different than the original one that was tested. Elizabeth talked a little bit about the kind of next steps in the model that she's been developing, that, you know, started off with 10 or maybe even 12 sessions, now trying to get it down to be much more transportable and down to 8 sessions. I work quite often with social emotional learning or other kind of multi-component sessions that often have 30 or 40 sessions that are delivered over an entire year or over 4 or 5 years. You know, we start developing these really Rolls-Royce interventions and preventative models, but don't really plan for the scale up of them. And so some of the conversation here today that I'm hoping to kind of bring us to is like, how do we prepare for scale up? What are things that we should be thinking about when we're scaling interventions and building those models from the start, and then the importance of the implementation structure around them? And so that is a question, or is this model, or are these various models even really ready for scale up? And so some of these questions are punctuated by the work that's gone on in more social behavioral health, the number of empirically validated preventive interventions to address mental health and behavioral health, whether it's around aggression or anxiety or substance use. I would say that many of those have been well validated, and there's a lot of support and endorsement for, quote, evidence-based practices and making them more broadly available, and even best practice guidelines to really encourage the scale up of these proven or evidence-based programs, and even policies or resources and incentives to be able to use those. But as we look at the field of child sexual abuse, where are we in terms of our prevention programs and thinking what is really ready for scale up? Is there a corpus of interventions that are really ready for that? And so some of the questions are, it's good to be thinking about and planning for scale up from the get-go when you're actually developing the model. And because that whole move from efficacy of these kind of tightly controlled trials to effectiveness and the scale up research, it's really hard and it's really, really expensive. And so if we aren't thinking about that from the beginning, it's going to be a challenge that we have to loop back on that cycle and reinvent some of our interventions. So we need to be thinking more about this, especially when we think about the process to scale up strategies. And there are some models for scaling up. I'll highlight kind of 2 that come out of the field of education that I've worked with quite a bit. One is called positive behavioral interventions and supports. There are over 29,000 schools across the country that are already using this model. It's been in existence for a couple of decades. And we happen to have done a number of randomized controlled trials testing this model, showing that it's effective. But I think it's really an exemplar of what is a model within the field of education that has developed not only a flexible enough framework to implement within a variety of schools, but also developed a really strong technical assistance center and models for coaching and data construction. So that might be a framework for you to take a look at as you're thinking about models for scaling and implementation support. Another framework has been put forward by CASEL, which is the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, that focuses on the distribution of information around social emotional learning, not one particular program, but also a bit of a clearinghouse for different evidence-based practices to promote social emotional learning. And they have really developed a very extensive infrastructure to share resources with district partners about selecting evidence-based programs and models related to social emotional learning, and then how to be able to track them using a generic set of tools and strategies. So those are two kind of frameworks that I think in the field of education that have really committed to evidence-based practice, but also an implementation support. I would say the PBIS folks kind of came to that a little earlier, and the CASEL folks are now, they had more content and more programs, and then struggled a bit more with how do we actually implement them. So it's nice to see these kind of two frameworks meeting in the middle there. And when I think about the next phase of work in this space, particularly as it relates to child sexual abuse and scale up, one is kind of understanding what are some of the factors that promote or undermine implementation and implementation quality. And then how do we leverage the findings from implementation science? Are there some unique elements around implementing these particular preventive interventions that need special consideration as we leverage the existing field, but also kind of add to it in relation to child sexual abuse scale up work? We've already heard from Lisa's presentation and others that the kind of general definition of implementation, just so we're all on the same page here. I'm thinking about that in terms of what the intervention consists of and the degree to which it was conducted as it was originally intended or designed. And so we can think about both the intervention itself and the core components of it. There's a lot of work right now about core components and thinking through, well, can we even just take out these core components and kind of repackage them and use them independently, or have them be tailored across different interventions or sites? That kind of is a little bit different than thinking about a standard way. So if there are lessons, if there are videos, if there are other materials or practice sessions, is this intervention actually being delivered as it was intended? And so those are elements for us to be thinking about. But a similar set of questions happens when we think about the support system. So with the initial training, are there core components of the training that need to be covered? Like the way that we go about training parents, or the way that we go about training teachers or service workers about how to implement these and how they should be delivered. So for example, in school settings, sometimes they'll buy a curriculum and they say, oh, well, let's have the teacher do it. Oh, she's too busy, let's pull in the counselor. But we don't necessarily know. That's somewhat of an empirical question in cases. Is it better for the teacher and more effective for the teacher to actually implement this content as compared to maybe delivering it in a different setting, like a small group setting, a pull out, or a counselor kind of facilitating delivery of content? And in fact, some studies, such as those of Second Step, which is a social emotional learning curriculum, show that it is actually more impactful to have the teachers deliver that content in the classroom as compared to having counselors facilitate it. And that's because they can promote generalizability and use those strategies across the day and kind of prompt those concepts across many different settings. Leaning again here on the positive behavior support framework, there's an emphasis on thinking about what are our systems for supporting implementation. Are we going to use a coaching model? Are we going to use a teaming process? What kind of data are those teams using to review on an ongoing basis? Not only are we achieving the outcomes that we want, but what kind of fidelity data and implementation quality data are we capturing to ensure that we're using those principles and practices across multiple settings? And are we using evidence-based practices that are derived from some of those decisions about the systems and the data to really emphasize a consistent package or delivery within the school setting? So in many ways, I think about the positive behavior support as more of a framework or a delivery system for a variety of different practices, and having an investment in that broader delivery system and leveraging a consistent set of systems and data points and having teams to review those data and make decisions about implementing evidence-based practices can actually even optimize the implementation of those individual practices because you have a bit of an organizing framework for that work. So we want to be thinking about adherence to the particular model, dosage, like how often we're doing the things that we're supposed to be doing. Is it delivering a lesson? Is it engaging in some kind of activity? Is it having a conversation? Is it reviewing concepts? What is the quality? Like how hard or easy is it for people to do that? And in fact, our research generally shows that most of our interventions aren't particularly hard to do. People often compromise on the dosage. It's like not hard for them to deliver the lesson. It's just competing demands on their time. So they choose not to do it. And issues around engagement, you know, how engaged are their participants? How exciting or interesting is the content? This can also be relevant for child sexual abuse if the content is kind of hitting too many hot buttons for people, they're going to disengage from that. They don't feel very comfortable and it doesn't have a lot of social validity or content match for them. And so that has got to be one of the parts of training, particularly in child sexual abuse, is getting folks to really be comfortable talking about and using the language so that way they overcome that barrier and don't drop components because they feel uncomfortable around that. For those of you stats folks on the line here, you might be thinking, well, how do we really analyze some of this data in the context of randomized trials? Because usually randomized trials, we randomly assign people to get the intervention or not, but there are a variety of other kinds of models such as hybrid or implementation designs that really you do focus so much on the implementation. Our team has been using some complier average causal effect models to really see, you know, how much does it matter about implementation quality? Because we assume that everybody kind of got the same level of implementation when we're doing our randomized trials. But this is a particular approach that allows us to think about compliance, meaning did you actually take the medication or did you deliver the lesson or did you engage in this particular content? And we do see that the effects for those that actually implemented the intervention are greater than those that were in the intervention condition but had low fidelity to the actual model. And that shows up not only in teachers that are delivering certain content, but it also trickles down to students as well. When we think about the variety of different factors that might influence implementation, again, using an example from a school setting here, the implementation quality of both the intervention itself as well as the implementation of the support system, that can vary, that there are core components of that, but individual level factors such as if the teacher is really open to the intervention or has buy-in or feels comfortable delivering the content. So these are factors to be thinking about at multiple levels. We spent quite a bit of time thinking about climate and the context of the school. Is it a school that embraces these kinds of concepts, or is it a more conservative environment where people don't feel very safe talking about their opinions? And then certainly the broader community environment, as well as the kind of policies and financing that could occur. And so typically when we're doing our implementation studies, we assess factors at all these different levels, really to try to understand what are those critical components that make the implementation successful. And so as you reflect on the interventions that you're working with, what are those factors at different levels that might actually influence the implementation? Again, some individual characteristics as well as some setting level characteristics. And then these more macro level factors are very critical for us to think about. What is the ethos in the community about talking about these concepts and talking about issues of sex and children? Where is that line between abuse and actual engagement? So other implementation considerations to think about are this differentiation between quality and dosage, and how do we actually ensure that we're assessing this through multiple indicators? I think a lot of people think about fidelity of implementation. They'll say, oh, it's a yes, no. Sometimes we have to create a cut point. Maybe it's 80% of the components or 80% of the people are delivering it, or you covered X amount of the lessons that were intended. But quite often it isn't really a yes, no. It's more of a continuous kind of gradient and trying to figure out where is that cut point to show that these components are truly the core components and need to be covered in order to optimize the outcomes of the intervention. Lisa also talked a little bit about this adaptation versus customization. I know a lot of the work that we do in school settings, people are like, oh, that's just not a fit for my students or not a fit for my school. I'm going to take this out or do that. And so these kind of planned adaptations and planned customizations that might happen are very important for us to think about. We also do a lot of adaptations across different grade levels. We're doing also work in rural versus urban settings and trying to think, what are these kind of contextual factors that need to be considered when we're implementing models. And Felipe Castro and Charles Martinez and others, I cited one of their seminal papers in the space. They have other more recent work around this, but really want to highlight that as an important consideration, especially as we're thinking about diversification of our population that we're trying to reach. Also thinking a little bit about the implementer level factors, how experienced is the person implementing the model? In fact, there is some research to show that earlier career people are actually a little more open to innovations than people that have been in the field for quite some time. Sometimes folks that have been in the field for a while are kind of used to doing things a certain way and aren't really as open to change or innovation or new approaches. And so there might be some benefit of targeting earlier career people as a way of trying to diffuse and push out these models with a little bit greater emphasis. There's also some really rich data by Charles Glisson across a variety of different settings about the importance of organizational health in the context. How safe do people feel about being able to take a chance and be open to those kind of interventions? And within the school setting, we found similar impacts, that schools that had higher school climate at the beginning did a better job and were faster at implementing these models than schools that really struggled organizationally, that they needed to leverage that organizational base. And when that isn't in place, they need to spend more time getting buy-in and getting consensus for the investment in that particular model. There's also some really solid work by Abe Wandersman around this space. So you see some of the similar models that I was talking about just around implementation, but as we think a little bit more about dissemination and scale up kind of work, these issues around climate and the macro policies are also very critical. And more recently, a group out of the Society for Prevention Research developed this model about scale up of evidence-based interventions across multiple different settings, including education, child welfare, behavioral health system, and talked about the importance of some of these macro level factors about support and leadership, having a skilled workforce that is ready to implement these models, and having the capacity and public involvement. So I wanted to transition a little bit more, talking about some of the models of implementation support. Like, how do we get there when you have this curriculum that shows up in your school or your community, or parents that are implementing models? What kind of support is available to them? And we often kind of use these terms interchangeably about training or technical assistance, maybe where does the line go between consultation and mentoring and coaching. I think many of these are very critical to the actual implementation and installation process. They actually mean slightly different things. And when you're thinking about rolling out different kinds of models within your setting, what is the implementation support model that you're really hoping to embrace, and how much readiness is there within that setting to really do that? So initial training might be the kind of train and pray, like you show up, you bring in the expert, they train, they hand out the books, and they say, good luck, everybody, I'll see you next year, and hopefully this went okay. There might be technical assistance, like here's a line that I call when I'm in trouble and I get a little tidbit of help or a fact, frequently asked question kind of response. And then there's consultation that may be, a little bit more of a one-way street of like, I can rely on this person for a little bit of support here and there. There may even be some near peer mentoring. Oh, we're adopting this program that this other community did, and so they're going to kind of mentor us along and take us under their wing, give us some tips and strategies. But we've spent quite a bit of time thinking more formally about coaching, and the dynamic of coaching is creating an opportunity for feedback, for data collection, for practice, for reflection, much more of an engaged process. And in fact, I think the research is pretty compelling that the impact of a coaching model is probably greater than just an initial training or just a one-time consultation kind of experience. And so when we think a little bit more about what's really in that black box of coaching, we want to really develop skills within and behaviors, and occasionally that takes some mind shifts and thinking about different types of orientation and increasing people's openness to the innovation. It may also leverage some motivational interviewing techniques. How motivated are you to really overcome obstacles? How much planning is really in place? And this can happen at an individual level as well as at a setting level, to really be thinking about systems level coaching that occurs there. And in fact, there's a growing body of research around coaching as an intervention support. This is a really nice study by Matt Kraft. It was a meta-analysis in school settings showing that coaching really does affect higher quality implementation and translate into better outcomes for youth. But there are some challenges as we think about this. As I mentioned, the approach to coaching varies when people say, oh yeah, I'm getting coaching or I'm getting some support, but that can really vary depending on who's providing that. Sometimes in a school, principals will say like, oh, well, I'll coach the team. But if you're also the supervisor and the employer and the coach, you know, that sets up a whole different set of expectations and constraints for implementation than say an outside person that comes in, or a teacher that's trained as a master teacher to help support implementation, or even a psychologist that may come in, whether they come from the district or from the community. We also don't know how much coaching is really needed to affect change, and that probably varies depending on the types of model and what types of coaching. You know, there's modeling, there's actual implementation support by delivering the intervention themselves, but there's a lot of power in just checking in with people and making sure and kind of nudging them along, helping them troubleshoot and making sure that this stays on their radar. And so we need to be thinking more deeply, I think, about what our coaching model is and the fidelity to the actual coaching model. So this is findings from actual randomized trial that we did. It was of a social emotional learning program in schools to look at impacts on youth violence. And so we had data we collected over 4 time points across the school year. And we had coaches that were working with teachers. It's about 200 teachers within this particular study. And we used an analytic approach called latent profile analysis to try to understand, like, what kind of coaching are these teachers getting? How much, just in terms of dosage? And the number of contacts are listed there on the y-axis, and on the x-axis we have the time points. And so we found that there was a pretty good chunk of our teachers, about 27%, that really just needed light touch coaching. They just needed kind of an initial meet and greet and 1 or 2 kind of contacts over the course of the 4 different quarters in the year. And then there were some teachers that really needed about half, a little over half, actually needed a fairly substantial level of contact. And that average, you can see here in the yellow, that more moderate group. And then there was a group of teachers that were kind of the screaming mimes, that every time we went in there, they're like, can you come back tomorrow? Can you come back? And we really realized when we analyzed these data further, as you can imagine, the teachers in this kind of red zone here were really struggling, not just with the intervention, but with other aspects of support. They really needed a lot of help. And when we started thinking like, wow, how can we optimize the impact of their work? You know, it's a little bit of the black hole to kind of go into these teachers that are in that red zone, because you can spend all of your effort and energy really trying to pull them into this and to affect some change there. And that may be your high risk group, and it may be worth focusing on them. But if you have limited teaching resources, wouldn't it be really nice to figure out who those kind of green zone and who those yellow zone ones are, so you can provide that kind of light and moderate touch, and you might actually affect more of a change for that group than this kind of higher risk. And that's in fact what we found, that we wanted to be cautious about how much time we were kind of investing in these higher need teachers, because we weren't really seeing that things were improving for them. They needed much more than we were offering, like mental health supports themselves to be able to deal with the challenges they were facing. They needed more than we were able to offer. And so that really kind of brings us to be thinking about what kind of data are we using to tailor our coaching process? How can we make an adaptive process rather than assuming that we're going to coach everybody the same way? And are there ways that you think about your coaching and delivery model that everybody gets one set of expectations, or like a tiered kind of approach? And so going back to that public health model that we talked about before, we can think not just about the interventions, but the people that we're actually coaching. Is there a universal coaching model that we're providing for everybody within that particular setting, all the implementers? But what about the people that need a little bit more support, those kind of yellow zone folks? What is our limit and what is our availability? And how impactful is it to focus on that group as getting a higher proportion of time and investment around coaching? And the ones that need more intensive support, maybe this just isn't a good fit for them in terms of the intervention. And maybe we need to be thinking about other kinds of supports, or that they may just never implement this particular intervention. And we need to provide some other kind of needs, meet their needs in some other kind of way. So the other thing to think about is coaching for programs. So how do I implement this lesson or this content or these activities versus thinking about coaching for systems change? If you're coaching to how to change the way that a particular organization responds to issues, that systems level coaching can leverage a lot of these skills as well. And so that really focuses on a different set of activities. But I think a lot of the principles around coaching and behavior change are relevant. I do want to highlight this relationship piece, the alliance that we talk about in our work. You know, this is more of those kind of interpersonal things. What might it take for coaching to actually be successful? Well, it takes an agreement between the coach and the implementer on the goals. Is it to implement a particular program or content? Is it to reduce the rates of child sexual abuse within a certain community? How acceptable is the content? Do they actually feel comfortable implementing? Are they invested in the coaching and the relationship? Do they have a motivation to actual change? Do they have access to the coach? If the coaching is remote, does that actually change as compared to in person? In fact, that's one thing during the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, we had done all of our coaching in person, and we're doing much more remote coaching online now. While there are benefits of that, there are also easy ways to just ignore people when they send you an email reminder about a Zoom call as compared to somebody that shows up in your classroom. And so there's a lot more engagement in this access in person. So a couple other things to think about along with that relationship and the alliance that gets developed between the two of them. And in fact, we find that the coaching activities without the presence of that alliance, the relationship piece between the coach and the person that's implementing the model, it really isn't not nearly as impactful in terms of increasing dosage and quality of intervention. I want to wrap up just with a few kind of resource acknowledgements. I'm part of a center, I'm a co-director of a center funded by the U.S. Department of Education that focuses on rural schools and rural school mental health in particular. And while rural may not be characteristic of your community, it was very serendipitous that we were funded to do scale up work to meet rural schools in the state of Virginia, Missouri, and Montana before the pandemic hit, because we have so many schools now that are wanting to access evidence-based interventions remotely. And so we have an intervention hub that's publicly and freely available that folks can access. Again, these are more around the social, emotional, and mental health kind of interventions, but there's a lot of intersectionality there with regard to child sexual abuse, what to do with kids when they're actually identified, or how to try to prevent co-occurring risk factors. So I'd highlight this as a resource. We actually even have some coaching models that are embedded in this and tools as well. There was a little discussion of cost earlier on as well, and we've built in a cost calculator to our rural center for school-based interventions. And this does include coaching activities and resources and training and materials and time spent implementing models. It also includes activities for parents that might be involved in delivering programmatic activities either at home or in the school setting. So this is a new kind of app that we've developed that lives and is publicly available on this site. Love for you to take a look at it. You go through and answer a set of questions about the activities that folks are engaged in, and it generates a report about the return on investment for the particular programmatic activities you're engaged in. So that might be a helpful resource. And just a few conclusions. I've been working with states like Maryland and Virginia for many years now, helping them think about scaling up models like social emotional learning and positive behavior support. And I do want to highlight the importance of that practice partnership between researchers and implementers, and be thinking a bit more about how we develop those partnerships to support large scale training and implementation. In the state of Maryland, we helped them over about 2 decades, my colleagues and I, implement and scale up positive behavior support to about 80% of the schools within the state. And we were able to do trials of the model as well as to do some evaluations of policy. In fact, there was a policy that was implemented by the state mandating implementation of positive behavior support. And we had an opportunity to look whether that actually increased implementation quality or outcomes. And the punchline there is it actually nudged them to get more training, but they didn't actually implement the model with any better fidelity, and they didn't achieve better outcomes. So we talk a lot about policy and how important that is, but we also need to be a little bit careful that we can put the cart before the horse. If we don't have a good implementation system, it may not be the panacea. We also had provided a lot of incentives, not just for submission of outcome data, but for implementation. We really focused in the state of Maryland for the first several years on getting quality implementation, the model, and recognizing schools for high quality implementation rather than just achieving good outcomes. So there's also the data is a 4-letter word, then can be a little bit scary to folks, but we try to use the data for decision making and empowering rather than to punish. And I think that's a frame that needs to be very important here. I've done a little bit of writing around this partnership work that feel free to take a look at, but I'd love to hear from some others that have really good partnerships that have helped support scale up. And these kind of partnerships need to really be authentic and balance the different priorities across the agencies, thinking about what are some real world constraints and value issues that come up, what kind of shared decision making occurs, and how, particularly as it relates to data. We're similarly working through some of these issues now in the state of Virginia in early childhood and assessment about readiness for learning, how quickly we can respond to requests that come in from the state around some of these issues, and how to form authentic relationships that aren't just one person to another person, but are committed more broadly about having a sustainable and champion kind of model for implementation. Also through our center, the team out in Montana has put together some really nice policy toolkit materials that are freely available. They've been using some Echo or Zoom-based kind of teleeducation models to provide consultation to different schools and school divisions about scale up and implementation. So that may be a resource that you're interested in as well. And this is a way to really think about developing additional partnerships to support scale up of evidence-based practices. Our focus here is largely in schools, but it's content agnostic and certainly could be leveraged for child sexual abuse prevention. So with that, I will just wrap up and be excited to hear where you all think about where is the field moving, what are models from other fields that may be helpful, and what are some of these lessons learned from kind of trials and tribulations of other prevention models and their rollout and their scale up, and how that can help inform the work that you all are doing in the child sexual abuse area. And that's it for me. I do have some resources, but I can share the slides out at the end. Folks are interested in that.
Excellent. Thank you, Catherine. This was awesome, I think. And one of the things that came across for me in your presentation, as well as echoed in Lisa's, is the, shall we say, plethora of frameworks and models out there related to implementation, dissemination, and diffusion, and all of these different words that we're going to learn how to use correctly. And so I'm wondering, Catherine, if you, and then Lisa, maybe you could add, what do we do? There are so many models. How does one pick one? And how do you kind of balance those decision-making approaches? And is there a possibility of using multiple models?
Well, I think of this as a bit of a toolkit. There may also be different models that are kind of helpful for you at different stages in the process. I think, I focused quite a bit on the school setting and the kind of how to get from getting ready to scale up. And I think some of these models can be helpful and tools in those places. But I'd love to hear Lisa's thoughts about that too. I'm not sure that there's one perfect model, and many of them have some common kind of themes, and some are a little bit more context specific to one area or the other. We're actually part of a implementation science training group that just got funded by U.S. Department of Ed, the Institute of Education Science, with the folks at Washington, Aaron Lyon and others at the SMART Center. And so we're really getting ready to dig into some training and implementation science for education researchers and practitioners. We're leveraging theories and models from multiple fields, but that's a little more tailored to the education space. And I know that there are other training institutes and models that focus, more on the child welfare setting and other kinds of mental health implementation settings. So I think there are some models that are a little bit more local to one field or another, but they often have certain themes that are kind of common across multiple models.
Yeah, and Catherine, I didn't know you were a part of that. We're all very excited about the SMART Center center that is coming on, the implementation center. So that's fantastic. You're a part of that. I would echo what Catherine said. I would also say, similar to what I was talking about in terms of really understanding where it is that you are trying to go with your implementation before you are implementing. So having some real thoughts about that can be helpful, because there are these different types of, so we have measures, we have models, we have frameworks, and some of those are more theoretical, and then the models tend to be more empirical, where we've got some data behind them. And each of them serve different purposes, I would say, with the goal being really like, what is, again, the context that you're working in, but also what is it that you're trying to achieve? Because if it's to implement something like we're talking about here, then I would really strongly encourage you to look at the process frameworks and the process models, which again is the space that I work in, because the goal of those really are to get you from point A all the way through the continuum to the end of, like, point Z or whatever it is where you're trying to go. And so I think that they tend to be, again, sort of sequential, temporal, and provide that kind of direct guidance on where you want to go. Now, if you're trying to determine like what's the best fit for our population, or a challenge that we're trying to overcome, then I might look at determinants frameworks. And so I think, again, I would just ask what it is that you're looking at before you make that decision.
Yes, I think that's helpful. And so to this point, a question has come in to say, is there a meta implementation framework to help choose an implementation model to follow? Kind of to your point, Lisa.
Yeah, I don't know, Catherine, if you know, I don't know of a meta one that combines them all together. I will tell you that the most frequently used ones, so there's the CFR, which is the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research. Laura Damstroder and colleagues have put that one together. There is EPIS, which I reference, so that's Exploration, Preparation, Implementation, and Sustainment. That's Greg Ahrens and his colleagues. I can put some references to both of those. They both have interactive websites. I'll throw those in the chat for folks if they're interested. But then there are other ones, like, so for instance, there's the iParis framework. There's one called Frame that is out that recently has an emphasis on the health equity part. So all of these are ones that are kind of summarizing ones that do take in components from all of the different frameworks.
Great. I'm going to turn it over to Jenny to wrap up our kind of panel discussion here. And I'll just, as we transition to that, want to say thank you to the Child Studies Center for, providing this infrastructure and setting, and the recording of today's session will be available on their website. And if you are interested in any of the slides, you can reach out to me and I will help facilitate that. So Jenny.
Yeah, thanks everyone. We have 5 minutes left, and we're just being sensitive to some of the comments and questions that have come through as all of us were talking. And there are a couple of people who wanted to talk a little bit more about the healthcare system as a delivery for sexual abuse prevention, and mentioning the Safe Environments for Every Kids program. And I noticed we have Howard Dubowitz has joined. I'm wondering if, Howard, you had the capacity to say anything about your experience in engaging the stakeholders for that intervention, and what you might say about the involving the healthcare system, if you're there still. Is he still there? Or Elizabeth, you may be able to speak directly to that too.
Elizabeth, you're on mute.
And so
I
it's
think you're
hard.
double muted.
Oh, does that matter?
Yeah, Howard is here, so that's even better. And so I was saying, so is Martin Finkel, and I think Howard and Marty might be collaborating on some stuff that.
Is there a way to unmute him?
Am I unmuted?
Oh, great,
Yes.
you're good now, great.
Well, in a few minutes, very briefly. So I would say, so we have tried and are trying to disseminate the SEEK model to primary care practices, mostly pediatrics around the US and to some extent abroad. And on the one hand, we've had some success. The model is implemented in about 29 states. But I have to say it's been a struggle, and COVID naturally hasn't helped. And as recently as this morning, I was in a conversation with people at the American Academy of Pediatrics and looking at reimbursement or payment structures as a huge barrier. You know, this, without getting too much into the weeds, primary care is going through a tough time, especially now. And so frequently I'll hear people say, I love this idea of how we could provide better, more comprehensive care. But if I ask my folks to do one more thing, they'll kill me. So it's a big, big challenge. We have not, I think, succeeded generally within pediatrics in convincing CMS or CMMS of why it's so important to invest in children's health. The system, folks might know, is largely driven by Medicare, and their priorities are different. And also, even within healthcare systems and organizations, I'm going to say there truly isn't enough of a commitment to pediatric care, to primary care. And so this is the landscape, the context that we're in. That said, clearly some are more altruistic, there are early adopters, there are some good folks, and we do our best to reach them. But it's a good fight, but it is a fight.
Yeah, so maybe, you know, we can organize some more talks around that larger implementation and maybe some of your lessons learned and combine efforts and policies, changing policy at the federal level for some of these things. But I appreciate your joining and your giving some of your initial thoughts. Marty, do you have anything to add to what Howard said? We have a mute. Sky, is there a way to, do we have to unmute Marty from our end, Sky?
Yes.
Oh, there we go, good.
Anyway, I obviously Howard had summarized things as we'd expect in an excellent manner. But one of the challenges that we find here in New Jersey is, in talking to the Academy of Pediatric Representatives, is that where's the science? In fact, the AAP, when we put in a proposal to make primary care prevention messaging, said, where's the science that demonstrates that talking to kids about this issue actually works? And so they're not willing to step forward unless they have something that is truly evidence-based. And it seems to me that pediatricians are a great opportunity, because of annual health maintenance assessments, to be able to help parents message to their child. Not that the pediatrician has to do all the messaging, but at least direct them where they can learn the messaging, because there's so many opportunities for a parent in the supervision, particularly of young children, for bathing, that they can have these conversations about okay and not okay touching and private parts and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So I think there's, You know, it's not one venue that has to deliver the message. It's the message by the mother, the message by the pediatrician, the message by the school, the message at the sport activity. And, you know, I tell parents or ask parents, how many times you have to tell your kid to pick up their clothing every day? How many times do you think you have to brush your teeth every day? Even these simple messages you can't tell one time and think you're going to be effective. The more complicated message, you got to repeat over time. And I think parents are wonderful for delivering that message, but they need the materials and need people to encourage them to deliver that.
Right. Yeah. And so you're speaking to the coordinated efforts that we talked about, you know, at the very beginning of there's likely needs to be multiple strategies. And to your point of how do we know it works or how do we know it is effective? Defining that is really important. Do we mean that we're changing behaviors, or do we want to see, or do we have to prove that rates are being effective? Because we all know that when we educate everybody and when we use these comprehensive strategies, the problem is likely to look like it gets worse before it gets better, because we're going to have more reports. We're going to have an uptick in people who understand what this is. So that is also a messaging thing to policymakers about that, what that investment truly is. So I think my impression of this morning, and there's one more person I want to get to, and that's Chris Peterson. You've got your hand up, and I know you're also a physician. So why don't you say something real quick, Chris, and then let's wrap up together and try to see what kind of community building we can work on.
Well, I'm thrilled with the presentations you provided today. They've been just superb. And one of the things that we've been doing through the state telephonic consultation service to pediatricians, child psychiatrists have gotten together all over the state and serve it in multiple areas to being available online to pediatricians when they have questions. They can call in and they can typically be online with a child psychiatrist within 5 minutes or be called back at their convenience. And how effective it is, I don't know. But another thing that we do as well is we've done a number of video presentations, which initially only went out to a few dozen people because it was just through the proprietary website. And when we put it on the childadvocate.net, it went out to thousands all over the country. And I can't but imagine that that's been helpful in some ways because we've gotten feedback from all over the place. But having a comprehensive program that offers the consultation, we also go out and do coaching and do presentations to pediatric offices, to a group of pediatricians, and we provide follow-up and consultation. We'll see their patients one time as a consultant, and I can only say as an individual, I feel like I know I've talked to hundreds of pediatricians, and the feedback I get from them is just wonderful.
Right, and again, you know, a resource-driven coaching model there as well. Thanks, Chris, for your thoughts. So just to wrap up then, because it's lunchtime and we've all been doing this all morning, just want to say thank you to everyone, and just to acknowledge that what we're building here hopefully is a community of stakeholders, researchers, practitioners, policymakers who are interested in really affecting this in all of our communities. So the extent to which we can engage each other and continue this discussion and provide the evidence base and provide the culmination of the research to those stakeholders, we should partner and keep the conversation going. So you'll hear more from us on this issue, and please don't hesitate to contact any of us if you have any questions. Kate will send out the slides to anyone who requests them. And just thank you again, Karen Bierman, for making this all happen and providing the resources.
Thank you to you, Jenny, and the whole panel of speakers. It was just a fantastic morning. Thanks so much.
And thanks everyone for devoting your time. I know how precious it is. So everyone stay healthy.